Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, great to see you again. And thank you for being here this morning. One of the things that I want to bring up is this issue of vehicle technology and cybersecurity. You know, these new connected vehicles, as they're called, particularly in light of the fact that China has emerged now as the largest exporter of vehicles globally, including here in the United States. And Mr. Secretary, I have to tell you, I'm concerned about the potential security risk of these connected vehicles built by the Chinese automakers and now operating in the United States, because through their massive subsidies and workforce practices, as I said, they've become the largest exporter. They're here. And these vehicles literally have the capability of being manipulated and manipulating the vehicle's life and safety systems, collect and transmit data, and implement surveillance capabilities embedded within the vehicle's technology. Now, I know the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party has sent a letter to the Department of Commerce and the Department of Defense issuing those concerns about these vehicles. Can you talk a little bit about what DOT, maybe NHTSA, whoever, can really help here in America ensure, like the Chinese are doing, any vehicle data collected in China has to be stored locally. Are we requiring anything like that?
Thank you for the question. It touches on something we take very seriously, which is the safety implications of vehicle cybersecurity issues. The reality is that vehicles are becoming more and more complex and more software intensive each passing year. There's already probably been more computerization on board than many consumers were aware of, but that is only increasing. NHTSA was involved in establishing a body called the Auto ISAC, an industry data sharing partnership, which is committed to quickly identifying and responding to cybersecurity risks and threats in the nation's vehicle fleet. And NHTSA has refreshed its own updated cybersecurity best practices, which we also believe is a contribution to this issue. Working with a number of stakeholders and also updating a cybersecurity incident response plan, which makes more clear the agency's responsibilities in the event of a cyber attack or any issue that would involve safety critical systems there. I think that going forward, we need to continue assessing how best to protect consumers without, of course, hindering the technological developments that can make vehicles safer, more convenient. There's a lot of consumer demand for this. But
did they say anything about collecting data here locally, keep it in America as opposed to going back to the CCP?
I'm not aware of restrictions in terms of how data is stored. Of course, most of our international automakers are not Chinese automakers, but you also know how many different components are finding their way into any vehicle, regardless of the OEM. So that's certainly an area that we'd welcome more dialogue on and be eager to work on.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to flip over to the EV standards and really talk about the CAFE standards that have recently been announced that everyone is, I don't want to say, I might say up in arms about, because nowhere in law did Congress authorize DOT to set fuel economy standards that effectively mandate EVs while at the same time will force the internal combustion engine out of the market. In fact, Mr. Secretary, federal statute expressly prohibits NHTSA from considering the fuel economy of EVs when determining maximum feasible CAFE standards for passenger cars and trucks. Now, can you give me a little update on the CAFE standards? What are they finally going to boil down to? And how does DOT plan to implement such a massive move to EVs without consumer buy-in, really? Because as we've all seen, so few really want to buy them at this point.
Well, I do think it's important to note that every year more Americans choose EVs than the year before, and very few Americans who choose an EV decide to go back. But I do want to agree and note that, as you correctly stated, NHTSA does not take EVs into account when it's formulating CAFE standards. They're about the quality of an internal combustion engine. The rule that was proposed would require a fleet-wide average of 58 miles per gallon by 2032. I know that seems aggressive, but frankly, every CAFE...
To say the least.
Yeah, but that's exactly what they said when we outrageously suggested that you could get 20 miles a gallon back in the 80s or 90s. So every time we raise the bar, we find that industry is able to meet it. And it's remarkable the innovation that goes on. But ultimately, we believe these are about not just cleaner air, but saving Americans money by having more efficient gas engines. And we know that these gas cars are going to be on the road a long time, even as the EV market share grows, which is part of why we continue to think it's important to meet our statutory responsibility with the CAFE standards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the remarks the chairman made about the tragedy in Baltimore and the families who lost loved ones there. But I think we need to have an honest discussion here about the Emergency Relief Fund. Going into this, there was a significant backlog, and recognizing that disasters like this can and do happen, but the severity, the number and severity of natural disasters as well wearing on our resources is significant. So we need to have this discussion because there's not enough in that fund, and we can argue, oh, we want to cut spending. Well, if disasters happen, they disproportionately impact one area that simply can't handle this, but they do impact the country. So if you could give us, Secretary, a deeper understanding of the status of the Emergency Relief Fund, how you envision a supplemental at least addressing this Baltimore disaster, but perhaps also the fact that we have a backlog and that we need to recognize that that spigot, that fund, has to be larger every year, just to be honest with ourselves that it needs more money.
Thank you for the question and for your attention to the emergency relief program, which we know is so important anytime there is an incident affecting transportation like the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse. For perspective in terms of the proportions that are in play, in May of 2023, FHWA provided $749 million in ER program funds to help 39 states, District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico make repairs for roads and bridges that had been damaged by storms, floods, wildfires, and other events. In January 2024, Federal Highways provided $729 million in ER program funds to help 34 states, as well as D.C., the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. The last update I got showed $950 million available in that fund, but we're tracking approximately $2 billion of unmet need, and that is not including the projected cost of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Now, to be clear, that does not necessarily mean that we would have $2 billion of requests ready to go looking for reimbursement in a single year.
What is that $2 billion?
So that's effectively a pipeline that will then be reimbursed as the states are ready and do their spending. We've had some cases where, just because of the length of time it takes to do reconstruction, checks may be going out 5 or even more years after the original incident, just through the flow of the project. But what we do see is there is a mismatch between the $950 million and the $2 billion plus and counting that we see by way of need. And so we would welcome support on ways to make sure that that fund is adequately topped up, knowing that severe weather is becoming more severe and more frequent, not less, and that even though we are separately working through programs like Protect to make our infrastructure more resilient in the first place against the kinds of threats that weather, natural disasters, and other effects can cause, we still are facing an uphill struggle and are going to need to do everything we can to be ready on the back end to respond when disaster strikes.
So if we equate this, as we often do with a household, it's like operating without insurance in a sense, and disasters do happen. What is the probable need for supplemental? And if we're going to go to that expense, what would it take to fill that fund with a reasonable amount of money, an endowment in a sense, to not have to have wanting to wait for a supplemental when the next disaster takes place.
Well, I'd certainly concur that it would be optimal to know that the fund is being refreshed at a rate that keeps up with the needs that have come to it. Again, if we're using recent years as an index, we would see the last 2 years disbursements would have been between 700 and 800 million, but we know there is even more, and you would want, given the Francis Scott Key Bridge, and you would want some kind of cushion there. So while we have not proposed a specific supplemental at this time, that gives you a sense of the proportion that we think would be needed in order to make sure the ER fund was at a healthy level, and of course would also spare us needing to go to supplementals in the future if we knew that there were adequate balances for the unmet need that was coming in.
No, again, and those details are matter. So again, if making sure the committee knows for the future, what would it take to get the fund at a healthy level to address the needs as they hit, and what would be a normal, appropriate amount to fund that spigot every year? Thank you.
Thank you. So, sorry. Being authorized at $100 million a year and then periodically being supplemented by Congress, we can work with that. But a cushion that's more in the line of the levels that we've found ourselves dispersing in recent years would help us to stay ahead of that and reduce the need for supplementals or additional work outside of the regular budget cycle.
Sheriff Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary. Great to see you again. And thank you for being here this morning. One of the things that I want to bring up is this issue of vehicle technology and cybersecurity. You know, these new
To Pete conversation. Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look forward to your leadership and your tenure in this committee. I've indicated to you privately I want you to be successful. Whether that means you want me to be for you or against you, I will do whatever is best for you. Secretary Buttigieg, good to see you again. As former Mayor Torres mentioned, it was good to be in your company at that Brightline event, and I want to thank Mr. Valadeo for the segue in this question that I have. The California delegation is incredibly excited to play a role in bringing the Olympic and Paralympic Games to Southern California in 2028. The ELA Olympic Organizing Committee is already fully engaged in the planning process. Historically, the federal government has provided significant resources to support and ensure the safety and success of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. Just thinking ahead about the department and their preparations for LA 28 Olympic transportation needs, how are you thinking through that? Realizing that this is always difficult. These are not annual things, but clearly this is a significant event. It was equal to 7 Super Bowls over a short period of time, and the significant challenges that we have. How are you guiding the department in thinking about the LA 28 Olympics?
Well, thank you for the question. And as you note, the Olympic Games are just a massive undertaking that requires a lot of forward thinking about how to move people around efficiently and safely. DOT, in particular, our Federal Transit Administration, have been working with the Olympic Organizing Committee, LA 28, since early 2023. Just had a conversation the other day, most recently with that committee, myself. And I should note there's an intergovernmental working group that's been set up by the White House to try to make sure that transportation, security, and other needs faced by the organizers are well coordinated on the federal side. We've had DOT staff tour the expected venues, housing, and transportation projects recently, and are committed to working with the LA region to make these the best Olympic and Paralympic Games in American history. A couple things of note: they have declared their intention to expand transit in the region to meet the needs for these games. So they are establishing a Games bus route network to provide the ability to reach relevant destinations and hubs. There's also the supplemental bus system, or SBS, concept. We'll continue to work with LA to address the challenges that come with that, basically mobilizing vehicles borrowed from other jurisdictions, trying to help make sure they can navigate funding, availability of vehicles, drivers, and mechanics, and just the logistics of borrowing buses from other transit operators in other jurisdictions. I'd also note there are plans to establish mobility hubs that will create inclusivity for all of the suburbs and the outlying communities that are going to play a very important role in the games. And we're pleased to see that the GM of LA Metro has been working hard to try to turn LA's resources to work for what we think could be a chance to really showcase what 21st century transportation can look like under the kind of pressure that the foot traffic associated with the games can cause.
And we want that to be successful. What resources do you anticipate needing from this committee in order to make that happen? Specifically, the bus program that you mentioned. It's been discussed about resources.
That certainly is one where funding could play an important role. We'd be happy to work with this committee and work with the organizers, depending on what funding Congress could make available. Just because we're talking about a lot of vehicles and a lot of pieces that have to come into place. We're also working to just make sure we have the technical expertise and assistance in place, and think that working group and that regular cadence of contact is going to serve us well.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Is Representative Torres mentioned, and again, Mr. Valadeo alluded to, we were at that Brightline event. I appreciate in your testimony, I also wanted to highlight that you discussed the project creating 35,000 jobs, lowering our carbon footprint and bringing communities closer together. As the DOT distributes funds from the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, how do we ensure that communities and transportation agencies at the state level are working together for that shared goal of lowering emissions while connecting communities?
Well, we certainly find that every state has a different strategy for addressing air pollution and carbon emissions. So we're trying to meet them where they are, and at the same time ensure that there's that every statutory high bar is met. Often we find there are projects that the states have been wanting to do for a long time, but until the IIJA just didn't have the resources for. And so whether we're talking about longstanding programs like the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program, or things like the Protect grants on resilience that didn't exist before the bill. We're mobilizing every tool that we can, and also I would mention, in addition to our state partners, sometimes directly engaging cities, transit agencies, airport authorities, especially if we find that they have maybe a higher level of climate ambition than their respective state capitals, and we want to make sure we're supporting them too.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Pete. Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I want to ask a couple of questions about the 6th District of Virginia.
It may take more than 30 seconds, so I'll wait for the second round if that's okay.
Ms. Wexton.
Thank you, Chairman Womack. Congratulations to you. I have no doubt you will continue Chairman Cole's high standard of leadership for this great subcommittee. As members of the committee may know, last year I was diagnosed with progressive supranuclear palsy, or PSP. I describe it as Parkinson's on steroids, and I don't recommend it. PSP makes it very difficult for me to speak, so I use an assistive app so that I can participate and you can understand me. I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for allowing me to do so today. Secretary Buttigieg, it's great to see you again. I want to take a moment to thank you on behalf of the father and father to be in my office for taking parental leave not long after you and Chasen adopted your 2 kids as newborns. Even though you didn't take anything close to the 12 weeks that your staff would, it was still a great example to set. I was also happy to read recently that although you are not the stay-at-home parent, you give the twins their bath every night. I'm intrigued that you composed a bath time song. My husband was a stay-at-home dad when our kids were young, and when they were toddlers, bath time was my special time with them. I'm not creative enough to compose my own song, but my bath time selection was I Like You by Ernie and Bert from Sesame Street, and yes, I sang both parts. If you're ever looking for another bath time song, I highly recommend it. I also want to thank you for the recent alternative PNT RFP that DOT released. We've spoken about this critical vulnerability several times before, and I'm excited to see things moving forward to address it thanks to you and the department's leadership. It's an exciting time to be a passenger rail supporter in Virginia. At the end of the last year, and in large part thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law, 2 major awards were announced through the Federal-State Partnership Program, for the expansion of Long Bridge, and for high-speed rail service between Richmond and Raleigh. The FRA also awarded 2 grants to extend the DC to Roanoke Amtrak line to Bristol and establish daily Cardinal line service, which travels right through my district in Manassas. Just yesterday, it was announced that Amtrak Virginia had its highest ridership ever this past March, with over 123,000 passengers. As you know, Union Station is the second busiest rail station in the country. We are all aware that it has significant infrastructure needs, yet it is getting no direct funding from the infrastructure law. I was glad to see the environmental impact statement and record of decision in March, but that's just one step towards the much-needed expansion project. We all want to maximize the investments in Virginia that I mentioned, as well as all the work that's being done in the Northeast Corridor, but we won't be able to if Union Station remains a bottleneck. My question for you is, how can DOT, FRA, our regional delegation, and other important partners like Amtrak work together to identify funding solutions for this critical project?
Thank you for the question. First, let me just note my admiration for the courage and spirit that you have shown in confronting your diagnosis and continuing to be an effective leader here in Congress, and for your kind words about my family. With regard to Union Station, we recognize its importance really as not just a regional but a national transportation center. And while we're glad that the President's budget proposes to reserve a $15 million set-aside for immediate state-of-good repair projects, as you are well aware, the ultimate needs at Union Station are at another order of magnitude. The completion of the EIS is certainly an important step. And I've been in dialogue with the District of Columbia and other stakeholders about how to best position Union Station for long-term success. That's going to include working to make sure that they are not just on top of addressing some end-of-life station infrastructure, but really preparing the vision for what the future can look like in ways that would qualify for discretionary funds. And of course, we'd welcome opportunities to work with appropriators on any source of funding that could help get that done. There's little question that it will require multiple sources, federal, district, Amtrak, and others. Certainly that's an eligibility for Amtrak with the Amtrak grants, but we know how many different needs they're trying to cover on the Amtrak side as well. And we'll maintain that dialogue to try to make progress there. Thank you.
I also want to thank you for your and the administration's steadfast support for our nation's transit systems and transit workers. Transit workers deserve to be treated with respect and to be free from violence, injury, and harassment in the workplace. I was very glad to see the FTA announce a final rule earlier this month taking major steps to protect transit workers, including giving workers an equal seat at the table with transit agencies and identifying and addressing safety and policy issues. How do you see this rule making things safer for transit workers and riders, and how can this subcommittee support that goal?
Well, thank you for the question, for your support of transit workers. We believe this rule is an important step forward in giving transit workers the right kinds of protections and the right kind of voice, participating in the newer structures that have been created by legislation, including committee processes, so that any kind of safety critical needs are addressed in a way that has to include the voice of transit workers. Operators have been through so much, and we think it's very important to back them, and believe it's absolutely possible to back them and hear them while also meeting the needs of management and operating these agencies. And I should note that I was thinking of them and of your longtime advocacy yesterday when the family minivan became unavailable, and I found myself on a WMATA bus in the morning and the Metro in the afternoon, getting my kids back and forth from daycare. And that bus was full of people who count on it every single day.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Jennifer, you are a valued member of this subcommittee, and I share in the Secretary's remarks about your courage and your willingness to continue to participate. And I, for one, am thankful for the technology that has been developed that allows you to be that valued and important member of this subcommittee. Thank you so much. We are going to be called for votes here in 3 or 4 minutes, which means in typical congressional fashion, we probably got a good half hour left if we need it. And Mr. Joyce walks in just in time to go have a seat, and I'll call on you here, Mr. Joyce. If anybody at the dais has a burning question that they would like to ask in round 2, I'm going to be able to yield that. And so, Ms. Watson-Coleman, I'll recognize you first. Just be as brief as you can so that we can Oh, I know you are. And you are recognized. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thank you. First, I want to thank you for your recent compensation program for flights delay and cancel, and the dashboard page that you have available for consumers. I think it's important that we help consumers as delays and cancellations continue to occur. But thank you for that, and I also obviously want to thank you, express my sincerity for including $496 million in the proposed funding for Second Avenue Subway. And thank you for coming to Harlem. That's an important project that will obviously connect Harlem to the rest of the world. And I also want to stress to my colleagues in the committee that this also provides a social equity component that I think is so important to the communities that we represent, those that have been left behind for far too long, and that need for these projects not just to be a transportation project for a transportation desert, but an economic stimulus for the communities that we serve. And I thank you for your vision and the president's vision for this particular model. Given the complex nature of urban subway expansions, what measures are being implemented to ensure that Second Avenue Subway Phase 2 remains on schedule and within budget?
Well, thank you for your ongoing support for this effort, and it was an absolute joy and one of the highlights of my time here to be able to celebrate that signature with people who had been waiting for so long in the case of the Second Avenue Subway, and finally seeing that funding. Now all eyes are on delivery, and that means making sure that we maintain a tight cadence of interaction and collaboration with MTA and all of the players involved in that. And we're doing that through our Federal Transit Administration, but this is also a big enough project that is being tracked at an agency-wide level too. We know that hurdles and issues can come up. We stand committed to working through any of those to make sure that this is delivered now that the funding is in place, because the people of those Harlem communities and really that whole part of New York that is served up to 125th Street deserve finally seeing that project through after having waited literally for decades in order to see it become real.
Well, I hope the subway leaves the station fairly soon, Mr. Secretary. But I have another question. As you know, I represent a district that has a significant number of Dominican Americans, and as you know, the Department of State and the government of the Dominican Republic are in final talks for a long-anticipated modern U.S.-DR open skies agreement. The cost of flying back home for many of these families is exuberant. When they go visit their families back home, sometimes they have to pay $1,500 to $2,000. So a family of four is going to have a difficult time going back home. And I want to know, given the evolving dynamics of international air travel, what strategies are in place to ensure the effective implementation of the modernized U.S.-DR Open Skies Agreement?
Thank you. I know how important this is, especially to Dominican communities in the U.S. and to the Dominican Republic, and have had direct conversations with my counterparts from the Dominican Republic about the importance of this. Our department and our interagency partners at State and Commerce are all participating in these negotiations. We've been negotiating for some time. We're very encouraged by recent progress, though we're not there quite yet. And the real focus is to make sure that we can get to a good place while maintaining the essential elements of a U.S. Open Skies Agreement and the policies that have helped to define that through us in our relationships with all of the countries where we have an air transport agreement. So we're looking forward to getting to conclusion on a modernized agreement for what is the largest Caribbean market for U.S. travelers. And Open Skies would certainly further facilitate travel and tourism by promoting competition and, we think, creating more affordable options for travelers.
Thank you. And finally, could you elaborate how the Federal Highway Administration investment will help to advance environmental restoration and cleanup within our nation's highways?
Yes, thank you. Often there is a brownfield element to some of the grants that we are pursuing, including federal highways. That's one of the things that, pursuant to our statutory authority, can help a project to score well in discretionary programs. And we certainly value chances to work with project sponsors to make sure that cleanups are, where required, part of the benefit of a transportation project for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Siscomani.
Thank you, Chairman, and glad to see you in this committee as well. I know you've been serving for a while, and it was great serving with you on FSG.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary. Texas has the greatest increase in population than any other state in the country. And I was a little shocked to learn that the chairman of TxDOT hasn't had an opportunity to meet you and have a conversation with you. Would you be willing to get on a call with myself, your team, and the chairman of TxDOT, an introductory call?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Typically engage with leaders of state DOTs in the context of AASHTO, but if there's a more specific issue we can work, or you'd just like to arrange an introduction, I'd be happy to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Mr. Secretary, San Antonio, Texas is home to one of the largest military populations in the nation. As a 20-year Navy veteran, it is critical, I know that it is critical that we equip our military personnel with the tools they need to succeed. One of those tools is travel, and we have yet to see a direct flight added to the DCA to San Antonio. There are a significant number of personnel that travel back and forth from San Antonio to our nation's capital. It is critical that we make this as painless as possible for our men and women in uniform. Currently, there are discussions about adding a direct flight between San Antonio and DCA. I'm in full support of that. My question for you is, do you believe it is important for our military men and women to have direct access to our nation's capital?
Well, having traveled on orders myself, I certainly recognize and appreciate the importance of good air travel and other travel options for our military members.
Excellent. My next question is, my district is massive. It's larger than the state of Pennsylvania. I have 29 counties. 27 of those counties are rural. Livestock plays a very important role in our economy. For years, livestock has relied on an exemption to the electronic logging device, ELD rule. Without these exceptions for livestock carriers, there is a risk of animals being left without proper grazing accommodations or becoming subject to other health risks. Mr. Secretary, do you have any plans to grant an exception to livestock haulers for the ELD rules in fiscal year 2025?
Certainly am aware of the unique issues that livestock haulers face when you have living cargo. It's a little bit different than boxes and inanimate objects, and I think that's contemplated in the practices of FMCSA. I'm not aware of any change to the current practice that is forthcoming in terms of some of the flexibilities. Of course, what we're trying to do is balance the importance of livestock with the importance of safety, and those ELDs are there for safety reasons. But we continually seek to strike the right balance to be reasonable in our flexibilities and yet demonstrate our commitment to the life safety issues that are implicated in any of our regulations with FMCSA.
Excellent. I also represent a large part of the Texas-Mexico border, nearly half of the overall Texas-Mexico border, and trade and commerce is a big part of that. Big function of trade and commerce is the infrastructure that builds out to that and the level of different roads. And I'd ask that you take a look at that as we're reviewing, updating USMCA and some of these other trade partnerships. It's so critical that we have the infrastructure built out, right? As we nearshore from other places, not only nearshore to America, but also North America. I think it's critical that we look to our partners to the south and how do we have this infrastructure once again built out. We can't just turn a switch off and turn it on without that investment in there. So I look forward to working with you and your team on these projects and others. And thank you once again for coming before the committee. And I look forward to that call. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Siscomani.
Thank you, Chairman, and glad to see you in this committee as well. I know you've been serving for a while, and it was great serving with you on FSGG, so great to be working with you here as well. Thank you. And thank you, Secretary Buttigieg, for being here today. First, I actually want to thank you, offer you our gratitude in Arizona for, it's great to see the I-10, as you know, a main corridor here for us in our state, both for commerce and for tourism, for safety reasons, all of the above, receive a desperately needed funding for widening earlier this year. So I want to thank you for that. The grant will go a long way in improving safety, travel, and commerce, like I mentioned. This was long overdue, so I do want to once again thank your department for prioritizing this important issue for Arizona. Now, Mr. Secretary, I'm sure you're aware that there was recently a major train derailment along the Arizona-New Mexico border in which a train carrying cars of hazardous material fell off the tracks, caught fire, and consequently closed down parts of the I-40, which is an essential route for trade and commerce. Many Arizona and New Mexico residents, as well as Navajo Nation tribal members, have been evacuated from their homes, and many more are concerned about the health effects that this derailment will have on their neighborhoods moving forward. While I'm grateful for the fact that local first responders took immediate and effective action to ensure that no one was injured, train derailment after train derailment should not be the new normal. In America, our transportation safety standards should be the gold standard, but the American people are rightfully beginning to lose faith in that standard when they see incidents like this one in Arizona putting their communities at risk. What are you specifically changing within your department to ensure something like this never happens again?
Well, thank you for the question. I passionately agree that there needs to be more done to secure rail safety and to prevent derailments and other accidents. In regards to this particular incident, that day I was in touch with the leadership of the Navajo Nation as well as Arizona and New Mexico. Our FRA administrator was on site yesterday and will continue to engage. That stretch of I-40 is back open, but there continue, of course, to be effects due to that derailment and that fire. Within the department, we've taken a number of steps, some of which we were working on from day one, others accelerated in the wake of the East Palestine, Ohio derailment. That's included focused inspection programs, including a focused review of the phase-in of robust tank cars that can handle the transportation of hazardous materials, as well as a route assessment for high-hazard flammable trains. Railroad by railroad, we've been conducting safety assessments and acting on the findings of those assessments. And I'm pleased to note that just a couple of days ago, we welcomed a new partner to our C3RS, or Confidential Close Call Reporting System, as BNSF agreed to join that pilot following the lead of Norfolk Southern. I will say, though, that the overall rates are an extreme concern. With the exception of Norfolk Southern, we have not seen a dramatic reduction in derailments in the last year with Class 1 railroads. In fact, for many, if not all of them, the rate has gone up. That's one reason that I take every opportunity to renew my urgent call for Congress to act on the Bipartisan Railway Safety Act. We will continue to do everything that we can that doesn't require an act of Congress, but given that it's been more than a year since East Palestine, we strongly believe that it is time for Congress to act, because that bipartisan legislation would give us a stronger hand and more tools to try to drive down that accident rate. I don't think most Americans realize that there were derailments on a daily basis in this country until what happened in Ohio, and every community that lives near a railroad, including where I grew up, is asking whether they're safe.
Well, I agree with you that there's a heightened attention on this, and certainly in Arizona, we're seeing the effects of the rates that you're mentioning. I do want to urge you and your team to prioritize rail safety, which it seems that you have a clear understanding of the rates going up on that, and get boots on the ground as soon as possible to see what the community is dealing with in Arizona as soon as you can. And as a result of this incident, analyze how DOT can do better moving forward, which by your notes, it seems that that's what you're doing. I'd love to work with you on this. And I do have another question, but we're running out of time, and I know votes were called, sir. So we'll, it may take more than 30 seconds, so I'll wait for the second round if that's okay.
Ms. Wexton.
And with that, I'll turn it over to my friend and the Vice Chair, Senator Hyde-Smith, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly appreciate that introduction and the working relationship we have. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I just want to talk a little bit about where we are, and while we're all frustrated of how long it took to get the FY24 appropriations packages through Congress signed into law, I will note that here in the Senate, we passed the T-HUD appropriations bill last November with strong bipartisan support, with the help of Senator Collins, for sure, and Senator Murray. Oh, And by Senator Kennedy, no doubt. But without the leadership and the vision of Vice Chairman Collins and Chairwoman Murray, we may well have been here saddled with continuing CRs through the end of the fiscal year, which benefits no one and eliminates Congress's ability to carry out its most fundamental duties. But thank you for being here to testify again on the budget request for the Department of Transportation, which has such a direct impact on so many people in every state. But when you appeared before the subcommittee last year, the department was contending with serious safety challenges, such as the failure of the FAA Notice to Air Missions system and the devastating derailment, as the chairman mentioned, in Ohio. Today, the department is grappling with two new emergencies involving Boeing and then the collapse of the Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge. I look forward to hearing how the department is confronting each of these obstacles and prioritizing the safety of the traveling public. And as Congress contemplates how to address emergency funding needs resulting from the Baltimore Bridge collapse and other disasters, we as appropriators must not lose sight of our responsibility to provide adequate annual funding for critical programs across the department. The administration's FY25 request for the Department of Transportation totals $108.9 billion, which represents a roughly $2.6 billion increase above the FY24 enacted levels. I'm once again disappointed to see that even with the proposed increase in overall funding, the request woefully underfunds or in some cases eliminates entirely programs that are priorities for this subcommittee. For example, last year the President's budget request includes $510 million for the popular Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grant Program, but this year the funding request has been slashed by more than half to just $250 million. Additionally, the pandemic underscored the importance of a robust, resilient, and reliable American port system. So it is difficult for me to understand why the administration's FY25 funding request for the vital port infrastructure development program is shockingly 66% less than the FY24 request, reduced from $230 million to just $80 million. While the administration may cite the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding for these programs as a counter to my concerns, we must recognize that the funding provided in that legislation is not perpetual. It's not finite and it's not perpetual. The practice of backfilling annual appropriations with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding is simply not sustainable, and the administration has not laid out a transition plan for funding critical programs in a post-Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act environment. The Infrastructure Investment Job Act's off-ramp strategy is necessary to formulate a funding that strikes a balance to meet the needs of all Americans, especially those in rural communities which face unique transportation challenges. Without such a strategy, under-resourced rural areas like those across Mississippi would be put at risk. This subcommittee's commitment to addressing rural needs is epitomized by the $250 million Rural Bridge Bundling Program that was established in the FY24 THUD bill, directing resources to sparsely populated areas for much-needed bridge repair and rehabilitation work. Our rural communities often benefit from the RAISE grant program, so I wanted to flag some of my concerns with how the administration is proposing to fund and administer these grants. I appreciate that the administration seeks to provide $800 million for the national infrastructure investments, which encompasses RAISE and mega grants, but I'm troubled by its plan to combine these two distinct programs without clearly explaining how much funding will be allocated under each of those programs. I have also concerns about the proposal to use the TIFA funds to recover to cover the full $800 million cost. I was pleased, however, to see that the budget request includes additional funding for the FAA to hire more air traffic controllers to manage the increased traffic in our national airspace system and to bring on more critical safety staff to help address the FAA's ongoing aircraft certification reform and oversight efforts. I also support the administration's intentions to continue fully funding the Essential Air Service Program. The Essential Air Service Program connects our nation's rural communities to the broader transportation network and benefits more modest airports like those found in Greenville, Tupelo, and Hattiesburg, Mississippi, by ensuring safe travel for customers traveling to and from the smaller markets. New businesses rarely locate in areas without dependable commercial air service, so supporting these rural airports is vital for the future economic development in these areas. To conclude, I believe that our funding decisions should be informed by fiscal responsibility and made with the American taxpayer in mind. Mr. Secretary, I look forward to hearing from you and working together in the American people to ensure that we have the safest, most reliable transportation network in the entire world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair Durbin. Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Secretary, I hope you'll hear the pleas from our chair to help the people of Maui. We've been through that in Louisiana. Frankly, I'm disappointed that the administration hasn't done more. I'm not laying that at your feet, but the people of Maui right now need more than anything else hope. And without a place to live, there is no hope. How those babies? How your babies doing?
Thanks for asking. They have figured out how to get out of their beds, which means they now control when we get up instead of the other way around. But they're healthy and happy.
Well, they'll be teenagers before you know it. You'll think that aliens have come down and abducted your beautiful kids and replaced them with terrorists, but you'll get through it. So, I want to ask you about, I know I sound like a broken record, the National Center of Excellence for Liquefied Natural Gas Safety, a subject that I know you're familiar with, Mr. Secretary. We're trying to get this built. It's frustrating, of course. It's not altogether your fault. Some days it seems like it takes longer than medical school to get something done around here. But I'd like to ask you where we are. Congress has spoken explicitly. We want this project built. We've appropriated money. It's supposed to be in Louisiana. The people of Louisiana and the universities there have gotten together. They want to put as do I, they want to put the center at McNeese. Other universities will be involved. How do we get this done?
Thank you. That's certainly the path that we're on. I know we've been engaging your staff, and with your engagement of PHMSA, I believe that we are on the path to advance. One thing I would note is that we've taken to heart your observation that the facility that is there now at McNeese State creates an opportunity to leverage what we're seeking to do with those taxpayer dollars that are entrusted to us. So what I can tell you is that we have directed the GSA to provide options in Lake Charles for that LNG Center of Excellence. Of course, we need to make sure that we follow the procurement process, and we need to make sure that there are adequate resources coming in from the center, and we're working with you on that. But certainly recognize the importance and the potential of this facility and the value that it could bring, making sure that we have the safest and most environmentally responsible LNG processes in the world.
So the LNG project is going to be placed in Louisiana, is that right?
Yes.
And within Louisiana, it's going to be placed in Lake Charles, is that right?
That's what we've directed GSA to do, is find sites in Lake Charles that would meet the mission. And again, part of the rationale for that, as you've noted, is that existing center, that academic center, being able to benefit from that co-location. So pending the procurement process, appropriations, and all that, that's the direction that we're headed in.
And you're working with McNeese State University and our other universities, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. In the 1 minute I have left, I'd like your opinion on something. I'm worried about Boeing, not just from a commercial perspective, from a national security perspective. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Well, the importance of Boeing in economic terms and in strategic terms can't be overstated, given the role that they play in American industry, in aerospace, and in not just the regional economy, but really the U.S. economy. I take care to focus on the safety dimension above all else, and certainly as regards the FAA's equities here, it is and can only be strictly about safety. But I also believe that getting the safety picture right, making sure they address their quality control issues and any cultural issues in terms of prioritizing quality and safety, will in turn redound to the benefit of the economic and strategic importance of a firm that large with that important of a role.
Well, we're not just competing against, we meaning Boeing, against Airbus. We're competing against countries now, other countries. I appreciate your candor on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary, thank you for being here, and thank you for always connecting, corresponding, and getting back with us on different concerns we might have together. I appreciate very much the attention from your office and yourself especially. The Biden administration would like to say that bipartisan infrastructure law provided $7.5 billion to build out a network of EV chargers in this country, but that's really not accurate. And I wanted to go over why, because I know we wrote the bill the way we did. Your department's responsible for allocating 2.5 of that funding through the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grant Program to strategically deploy publicly accessible refueling infrastructure along designated corridors and other accessible locations. While EV charging is eligible for this funding, it is not the only technology that there is. We were very clear in the bill about that. Hydrogen, propane, and natural gas fueling infrastructure are also eligible, which is why I include an amendment in the Senate's markup of the fiscal year 24 transportation appropriation bill last year that directs your department to give fair and full consideration to each eligible technology and not to restrict awards to just EV charging infrastructure. Unfortunately, of the 47 awards provided under the program so far, all but four, 43 of them, and all but four have been exclusively, 43 of them for EV charging. So I just get your assurance that you are looking or understanding how the bill was written and the purpose of the bill. And if you're trying to correct that or looking at the inequality of how this distribution is going.
Thank you, and I can assure you that in reviewing applications, the department is always taking care to make sure that it conforms to statute, including those that creates those eligibilities for these chargers. I think the bulk of the successful grant applications have been electric for the same reason that the bulk of private sector investment in alternative fuel for light-duty vehicles has been on the electric vehicle charging, but any program from the Alternative Fuel Corridor Program to CFI that has an inclusive definition where EVs are eligible, but EV charging is eligible, but not the only thing that's eligible, we will apply that faithfully and judge every application based on its merits and its conformity to statute.
The thing I mean, just if your people would consider in rural areas where you might have challenges from the grid and electrical capacity and things of that sort, and the larger trucks, they're not going that direction. They're looking at hydrogen for long hauling. They got the horsepower, they got the ability to do it, and they're very clean. But we never have, and we're having a hard time getting hydrogen going because I've got to be honest with you, the administration's a little bit lackluster on how we make hydrogen and things of this sort. But I can tell you it's the fuel of the future as far as the heavy, trains, even planes, but definitely trucks. And fueling stations in remote areas, Montana, Wyoming, all the West, in areas like we have mountainous things, that electric just doesn't do it. So if you could consider the terrain you're dealing with and the locations you're dealing with the alternative fuel sources, it would help tremendously, Mr. Secretary. Also, I'd like to I know you've been very helpful on Corridor H. Corridor H in going through West Virginia. President Johnson, as part of the Appalachian Development Highway System, 1965. We've been trying to connect this since 1965. We're getting close. You all been great. We're almost there. We need your commitment to finish this damn thing. And so I hope it's high on your radar screen, and I know you have some tremendous staff that understands West Virginia very well, sitting behind you, that understands it, lives in that part of the state of West Virginia, that understands how desperately we need that. And the I-81 connection would be unbelievable, sir.
Thanks. Of course, we're very mindful of the importance of Corridor H and the entirety of the ADHS, and we'll continue to work on that with the resources and eligibilities that we have.
I know. And then also, the ticket agents. Remember, we've been working on ticket agents. You helped us get it back in West Virginia. We say the New River train and expand the rail service that keeps the state connected to the rest of the nation. Only thing that we're asking for, the agency was thankful that the agency granted $500,000 to Amtrak this past December. Without that $500,000 dedication that you put towards Amtrak, we would have not kept those systems that we have. What we have right now is we have the Capital Limited, which runs through the Eastern Panhandle, and the Cardinal, which runs from New York City to Chicago, both traversing our southern borders, southern part of our state. The Summit Bechtel National Scout Reserve has been blessed by this, the state capital in Charleston, Marshall University in Huntington. It's truly a lifeline, and people are using the rail more than ever before. We made upgrades into our stations to handle the, truly treat the passengers in a much more friendly atmosphere. So with that, the stakeholders in West Virginia, we're working to restore a 7-day-a-week service on the critical transportation route to my state. If you all would look into that, we would be deeply grateful for that, because I think it justifies it.
Thank you.
I don't know how much you all know about that, but are you finding there's more of an uptick on train traffic?
There's certainly more and more interest and excitement in passenger rail. As you know, my boss is all about it, and we're doing everything we can to deliver both restored service and reliability.
How's the high-speed thing? How's the high-speed working? I've been watching that, and I think you're about California and Nevada, Las Vegas.
Yeah, it was a great day. We were able to break ground on that. They aim to have that train in service by 2028. It would mark the first high-speed rail service in revenue on U.S. soil, and I believe the first time an American passenger buys a ticket, there's no
real
going
quick,
back.
if I may, Mr. Chairman, on that, Mr. Secretary, I looked at that and I thought, that one route, that one train has a chance to be revenue neutral if you can, revenue making. Do you all see any forecast that it can pay for itself once we have the investment made?
Obviously, we're investing in that capital side, but
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons why you see a private player building that is they believe in the extraordinary revenue potential there. And while every market's different, every line is different, that's one that seems especially well
So
suited.
we're not obligated to maintain it and take care of it and everything as far as after the
No,
capital
we
investment?
made a capital grant of $3 billion and then another loan, but that's really about the capital side. It'll be up to the business to operate it.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate it very much.
Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I am very passionate about the workforce in aviation. I represent a rural state, a very rural state. So does Senator Collins. And I just see that there's so many young people that don't have the exposure to aviation. I tell the story of Jesse Bowie, my friend that lived in a neighborhood that was close to the airport, very limited opportunities, but he could ride his bicycle to the chain link fence to watch these airplanes land in a little general aviation airport. So I know that he became a pilot, he owned a flight instructing school, and Jesse he became successful, but only because he could ride his bicycle to that chain link fence. But I know that kids all across Mississippi and America could thrive with careers in aviation, including mechanics, pilots, flight attendants, and air traffic controllers, if they were just given the opportunity. So I do have this passion to reach out to students at a young age, from elementary school to high school, so they can learn about the potential that a career in aviation has to change their lives. The FAA has established several grant programs to invest in the future aviation workforce by providing grants to academic institutions and the aviation community. While I appreciate that these investments are being made, what more can FAA do to get more children involved in aviation careers? Because I do have a dream of developing a program that can bring kids out to smaller airports. But what can FAA do to get more younger people to strike that chord in them that they may not know is there?
Well, thank you for that question. It's close to my own heart. The imagery that you've described reminds me of my father taking me as a kid to look through the chain link fence at South Bend's airport the day that Air Force One came to bring President Reagan to visit the University of Notre Dame. And seeing that jumbo jet was one of the reasons I was the kind of kid who grew up with cockpit posters in my bedroom, only to wind up working in a very different way in aviation than what I might have originally imagined back when I was hoping to be a pilot. We know that sparking that early sense of creativity and passion can last a lifetime. And we also know that the country needs to engage more of the talent that's out there. We do have programming that we believe is meaningful. One that I would point to is the Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, Aviation, and Space Education Program. It's a mouthful, goes by STEM ASVED. Just knowing of your interest in this issue, pulled some numbers and learned that the FAA's held 11 events so far just in Mississippi this fiscal year through that program, but would absolutely welcome more ways in partnership with you and the committee to make sure that we reach more people who have the aptitude and may even already have the passion, but may not have the exposure or the knowledge that they could very well thrive in these careers.
And I know so much of that is on us as states. But I just want to reach out and let you know we will need help from FAA. And, you know, it'll take a lot of folks in the aviation world to make this a reality. But as I continue to work on the program, I'd love to have US DOT and FAA involved to truly amplify the federal government's role in aviation and the opportunities for more young people. I just appreciate your willingness to work with me on that. Talking about other things in Mississippi, Mr. Secretary, the extreme drought conditions that Mississippians experienced in the summer and fall of 2023 left behind almost 13 million dead trees across our entire state. The prolonged drought severely stressed the trees, especially the softwood varieties, and led to major outbreaks of southern pine beetles that is wreaking havoc on our timber harvesters, communities, and landowners. Many of these trees stand along right-of-ways maintained by the State Department of Transportation. And driving up and down the state, you just see them everywhere. It's something like I've never seen. But dead and dying trees throughout our Pine Belt region and the entire state have fallen onto roadways, posing serious safety hazards and forcing Mississippi DOT to expend limited highway maintenance resources on the cleanup. But we have the obvious risk of the traveling public, but I understand that these activities may not be a great fit under the Federal Highway Administration's Emergency Relief Program, in part because they're largely preventive in nature. Still, the fact remains that this is an emergency and Mississippi MDOT needs relief because we certainly didn't expect a drought to cause trees to be on our highways. Are you aware of any existing U.S. DOT programs that Mississippi DOT can utilize, and can I get your commitment to work with these to support these critical safety efforts?
I certainly am committed to working with you to find eligibilities and programs where this may apply, including potentially discretionary grants headed to Mississippi. I'll ask my team to follow up and see where we can be helpful there.
Thank you. I truly appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chair.
Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Hyde-Smith. Nice to be here. It's good to see you, Mr. Secretary. In March 28th, with Senator Lujan, we sent a letter to you regarding the NHTSA's Advanced Impaired Driving Prevention Technology rulemaking. Safety on the roads, especially in the windy and mountainous roads of my state, scattered across West Virginia, is a top priority for me, as it is, I'm sure, for you. I'm eager to see these promising technologies in new cars starting in 2026, as the IIJA has required. I understand that the comments received have been robust, And I hope that this is a top priority for NHTSA, as this action will save thousands of lives and make roadways safer. The NTSB's comments note that NHTSA is over a decade behind on these technologies, and automakers note that adding these measures could add to increased costs and consumer backlash. How are you balancing these competing comments, and do you anticipate that such a wide swath of comments could delay the final rule before it's finalized in 2026?
Well,
What's the status of that?
Thank you for your attention to a very important safety issue. Each year, we estimate about a third of all roadway fatalities are related to impaired driving, which is why NHTSA has been energetic in working to comply with the rulemaking provided for in the infrastructure law. The comment period closed on March 5th of this year. As you noted, the comments were robust. Just to put some specificity to that, there were about 18,000 comments that were received. So NHTSA is reviewing those. Of course, that's both the right thing to do and legally required of us. And we do need to make sure that we balance all of the different concerns that are in play, but do it in a way that, at the end of the day, meets our safety mission. So they will continue to work through those comments, and every intention and expectation is of a prompt rulemaking here. Of course, we also need to make sure there's good understanding of how the technologies will be put into play in practice, knowing that it's one thing to have a technology available or prototyped, another to mandate it across the U.S.
So do you anticipate it being in on time in 2026?
I haven't received a definitive timeline for NHTSA, I think, because they're still grappling with the substance of the comments that have come in, but that'll certainly be our aim.
Okay. Well, I'm going to sound like Senator Kennedy because I am a broken record on my issues as well, and this is one federal decision. We put that in the IIJA, and one of the key components is the 2-year goal for completing the environmental review process. I've been told that these provisions have been implemented. In March, my staff received a list of the Federal Highway Administration of one federal decision projects that are currently underway. There are 8 projects on that list. Hard to believe there's only 8, but there's 8 on there. Of these, 6 are listed as currently extended or delayed and are expected to have an extension or a delay in the future. 2 remaining projects had notices of intent issued in February, and their schedules have not been posted on the dashboard. Almost all of these projects have missed or are expecting to miss their 2-year goal. I find this very frustrating. The point of this is to move projects, not just to get the projects done, but it saves money. You get more projects done if you can do it in a timely fashion. Will you commit to making the relevant staff at the department available to brief my staff on the challenges facing each of these projects and what the agency is doing to address these?
Yes, we'd be happy to engage with you on that. I can assure you nobody's more impatient about getting projects done than...
What do you attribute the delays to?
Each project has, of course, its own characteristics, but we can only certify that permitting has been met if it's actually true. So a lot of it is a back and forth with the state. But I've directed our team to accept a kind of moral, if not legal, responsibility for how the states are doing, to be side by side with them.
Well, but it's not really just meant for the states. It's meant for all of the federal agencies to be cooperating and moving into a one federal decision. What kind of accountability are you asking for? EPA, Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife?
Yeah, so that's part of why we have the kind of interagency partnerships that were stood up through the White House's leadership on implementing the bill. And I think that that's reflected in the fact that, for example, every schedule posted on the dashboard for an EIS that has been initiated since the Fiscal Responsibility Act passed is shorter than 2 years, compliant with statute in that regard. Obviously, we have some EISs that were initiated as early as a decade ago, so those have gone through a lot before we even arrived at this. But when it comes to something we can do, for example, the provisions that you put forward that made it possible for us to adopt a categorical exclusion, working with DOE so that something didn't go into that more elaborate process, that can help us on the front end.
Are you using that provision?
Yes, I believe that's...
Could we have follow-up on that?
that?
Which ones are, could we have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, we'll try to get you a sense of how that's coming to play in the EV projects.
Yes. I do have another question on project grant agreements. They're not getting out the door. They're delayed as well, and I'm very frustrated by that, but I'll submit this for the record. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Secretary. A little over 30 years ago, I introduced a bill in the House of Representatives that banned smoking on airplanes. I was sensitive to the environment in the airplanes, the safety of it, public health and the like, and thought the flying experience would be improved if smoking was removed, and it was. I'd like to address another issue about the quality of the experience in the airplanes today. After you're in your seat and have your belt fastened and you're on your underway, there's an announcement that usually comes around in most airplanes, not about just critical safety issues, but incredible credit card and frequent flyer opportunities. It's almost like the farmhand force-feeding a goose on his road to foie gras, the information that is jammed on you, and then the flight attendants walk up and down the aisles and pass out these cards for applications for their branded credit cards. They stand at the door as you leave the aircraft. It's a heavy sell. It's a hard sell. And you ask yourself, why? Why are they spending so much time doing it? I think you know the answer. Because major airlines make more money off their branded credit cards in your pocket than they do off their aviation operations. It turns out those big airlines are actually credit card companies that happen to own a few airplanes. So the question I have for you is, who polices the ranks when it comes to these frequent flyer programs? There's a lot of expectation and a lot of investment in those programs by millions of Americans. I know that you've initiated, through the administration, an interest in this field. Can you tell us more?
Yes, thank you. While we are, of course, not a banking regulator, we are an airline regulator. And as those business lines get blurred, we're recognizing that our responsibility to protect passengers may well come into play. We share your concerns about the rights of passengers who count on these or are told about these rewards programs. DOT has launched a review of our U.S. airline reward programs to determine if there are any unfair and deceptive practices, and will take enforcement action if appropriate. That includes analyzing consumer complaints and meeting with airlines, and we're considering soliciting further information. The other thing I would mention, having noted the boundaries of our lane, is that we're coordinating with CFPB, recognizing that there is a mutual concern here. In fact, we plan to convene a joint hearing with CFPB on May 9th with industry representatives, labor leaders, and consumer advocates to talk about competition issues and challenges that consumers are experiencing with some of these airline and credit card reward programs.
I'm glad you're doing that. And I understand you have a jurisdiction that isn't exactly consumer protection, but this is really an entity that's become so important to so many families across America. We have troubling reports that airlines are devaluing points, making it harder for consumers to achieve promised rewards. And at certain times, the cost of purchasing points from airlines' websites may be 3 times the value of the points at redemption. The list goes on and on. There is no policing the ranks of these airline credit card companies when it comes to this benefit. I have a minute and a half, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention location, location, location. I'm glad you led off your statement on rail service with Chicago, Illinois. You can understand my interest in that. I hope that we can find a way to finally make an investment that will dramatically change the performance of railroads across the United States, dependent on efficiency at Chicago. We've had some horror stories in the past. We want to get those behind us. What is your thinking on that?
We certainly believe that there is enormous opportunity for investments to continue to yield improvements, and we know how important that is to your region. Welcome further discretionary grant applications in that regard that would be helpful, and I know our personnel have been engaging with teams from the region to discuss this too.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Perry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to begin by giving credit where credit is due. I want to thank you for visiting South Central Pennsylvania and providing some attention to that. And of course, you're probably aware, as you probably are likely crossed the South Bridge across the Susquehanna River. We've got a big construction project there, bipartisan support, and would just encourage your continued attention and support of that. I want to turn to the electric vehicle market. As you can imagine, seems to me that the industry is in a bit of a tailspin, and the government-funded EV bubble appears to be deflating, even though that we're subsidizing it at tune of billions of dollars. The fact of the matter is 98% of all the cars on the road today are traditionally powered. 97% of the annual car purchases are traditionally powered. I know you're likely to talk about the 7% share of new car sales being EVs, but the truth of the matter is that it belies the fact that 3/4 of those car sales are used vehicles, which aren't EVs, and the cost of those grows every single day as EV costs go higher, driving the cost of traditional vehicle sales higher. The Energy Information Administration has found that the U.S. share of electric vehicles dropped in Q1 of 2024, and the context is tens of billions of dollars being showered down on the industry, and still this is happening. We're literally paying folks to produce the cars, sell the cars, and buy the cars, but the consumer sentiment continues to be moving away. Now, according to McKinsey & Company, your former employee, nearly half, 46% of electric vehicle owners are likely going back to traditional fuel vehicles. Consumer Report found EVs to be associated with 79% more problems than conventional vehicles. J.D. Power found customer satisfaction declining across the board, especially regarding level 2 charging, with roughly 20% of attempted charges ending without success. I can't imagine going to the gas station 20% of the time, leaving empty. Cox Automotive found that EV inventory nearly twice that of the overall market, and 3,500 car dealers, some of which visited me and I represent, sent a letter begging you and the administration to stop these mandates. Now, recognizing that attempts to bribe the industry and the public into EV adoption have literally failed at this point, continue mandating CAFE standards, EPA tailpipe standards that are de facto EV mandates. And ideological allies in 12 states are seeking to ban the sale of non-EV cars. Now, we can talk about the proper role of government. That'd be a great conversation, because I don't think that we have the authority or should have the authority to limit what consumers can buy in this regard, or what they can own. But clearly, Mr. Secretary, this isn't working. So I'm wondering, is there some point, and if you've identified some point where you will stop, where the administration will stop, where the federal government will stop this requirement and let the market decide, as opposed to this central planning model and this dictatorial policy?
Well, thank you. Given time is limited, I will confine myself to addressing the factually incorrect portions of what you have said, beginning with the assertion that EV sales are going down. They are, in fact, going up.
Does that include the government sales or private sales?
Every single year,
private sales
more
or government
Americans
sales,
have purchased
Mr. Secretary?
EVs. The entire market.
The government's forced to buy them, so sales are going up. But private sector,
there are private sales too. Yeah.
I'd like those numbers.
Sure. 1.2 million EVs were sold in the U.S. in 2020.
How many government and how many private?
We'll get you that breakout, but as you know, more private citizens buy EVs than government purchases.
No, I don't.
Let me address the
that's
second
factually true.
factual mistake in your remarks, which was that EV costs are getting higher. They're in fact getting lower, and according to J.D. Power, have now reached parity or are slightly lower than
With
the
or without
equivalent
subsidy,
gas-powered
Mr.
car.
Secretary? With or
that
without
does, yeah,
subsidy?
that does include the subsidy. That's right. But the point is, they are going lower.
But they're
passing
not,
year.
because we're all buying
Your statement
them.
that they are
We're all
going
paying
up is
for them.
incorrect. The third incorrect assertion you made is that sales dropped in Q1. They did not drop compared to Q1 of the previous year. Of course, if you compare them to Q4, they drop, because they always do, because car sales are seasonal. But I would imagine most people are aware of that. And
No, I'm
fourth,
talking about
I want to
particular
address the
EV, Q4 to Q1. EV, not just overall car sales.
Any car sales go down Q1 to Q4 because more people buy cars in Q4. But what I'm telling you is every single year, more Americans buy EVs than the year before. And the word tailspin is just a bizarre word to use for a growing sector of our economy. We also think that since that's the way that the market is headed, we should not allow China to build on the advantage that they developed during the Trump administration, not because they're environmentalists, but because they understand the economic power of trying to dominate the EV market. We want those EVs to be made in America, and increasingly they are.
I'm happy to have them made in America, Mr. Secretary. What I'm not happy about is the mandate. The American people should be able to buy
That brings me to the
any
fourth and
vehicle
final
that
thing
they
that
want to.
I need to
yield.
challenge as being factually inaccurate, which there is no mandate. You can purchase a gas car if you want to pay gas prices at the pump, but if you don't, you can purchase an EV with our help.
We're going to try to get one more question in, Mr. Cohen.
One yields. Mr. Babin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank
for
you very
questions.
much. Thank you for coming to the Hill today, Mr. Secretary. In 2023, the state of Texas received less than 2% of all DOT federal grant awards, despite having contributed over 10% of the funding to the Highway Trust Fund. Is Department of Transportation making any attempts to be more equitable in their distribution of federal grants across the states?
Thank you, Congressman. We pay close attention to the importance of geographic distribution as one of the considerations in our competitive programs. Of course, each program has its own criteria. Project proposals are evaluated based on how they score against their criteria. Certainly a number of some of the most compelling projects we've been able to support have been in Texas. We recently were able to award $25 million to the Port of Houston Authority, for example, out of our reduction of truck emission at port facilities program. This is over and above the formula dollars. But one other commitment we have is if a project comes in, they don't quite make the cut because it's an extremely competitive round, we will work with that project sponsor to help them put their best foot forward coming around next time.
Thank you. Why did DOT release notices of funding opportunities, or NOFOs, for federal grants such as MEGA, Rural, and Infra for fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 26, while we're still in fiscal year 24? And should not these grants be awarded in their respective fiscal years rather than potentially circumventing a new administration?
The short answer is in order to cut red tape. While there are some programs that are administered on such a routine basis that it makes sense to have an annual process and run it again every year, we think in other cases by folding in either multiple programs, multiple fiscal years, or both, in the same way that a common application for college means you don't have to fill your zip code in 7 different times, we can reduce the amount of bureaucracy for project sponsors and the amount of processing work for our own team as we're working through that.
What steps is USDOT taking to address the issue of grant agreements between USDOT and federal discretionary grant awardees that are taking more than a year to complete? And how can we expedite these agreements to ensure a timely disbursement of funding to the award recipients?
This is a topic that I'm very focused on right now, both in recent years and in the prior administration. It was not always considered unusual for it to take more than a year to get from an award announcement to a grant agreement. We think compressing that amount of time is part of what it'll take to deliver projects more quickly. Part of the challenge, of course, is that a grant agreement can only certify that a project meets federal requirements if it's actually true. But I want to make sure we take some responsibility for a project sponsor working through that process rather than just folding our arms and saying, you know, we're not going to sign off until you do everything on your own. So I can assure you we talk about this just about every week and are taking a number of steps that we think will help compress that process.
International freight movement continues to increase at incredible rates, and in Texas, our state agencies, including the Texas Department of Transportation and our Department of Public Safety, are working with autonomous vehicle industry to make border crossings seamless, effective, and efficient while ensuring illegals are not coming across the border. What national support and funding enhancements specifically to the border region will be proposed to accommodate the increase in freight coming from Mexico into the United States and passing through to Canada?
As you note, there is a strong and swiftly growing demand and flow of goods across that border, and it's going to be more important than ever to make sure it is safe and secure and at the same time that it flows efficiently. Several of our grant awards have gone to modernizing land ports of entry in ways that we think will help them efficiently do so. And our Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is very focused on making sure that inspection capacities keep with the times. Would certainly welcome an opportunity to work with Congress on any authorities or resources that might help us take advantage of those new technologies.
All right, and one last final question. Perhaps you read the editorial in last weekend's Wall Street Journal entitled "Biden's LNG Export Pause Hits Ukraine." and I have a copy of it here, which I'd like to enter into the record, Madam Chairman, that decried the Biden administration's decision to block LNG exports to our allies. This article specifying Ukraine, and this which seemingly plays right into the hands of Vladimir Putin. Secretary Buttigieg, you have responsibility in your department for the Deepwater Port Act, which would improve our nation's ability to export energy products around the world. However, I understand that your department is not implementing the statutory deadlines and notices imposed by last year's NDAA, and is not having regular or any in-person meetings with applicants so they can possibly understand the agency's concern. I've heard so much runaround, and I'd just like to know what the truth is, if you can.
I can assure you our Maritime Administration team works diligently on applications that come through. They are not subject to the restrictions that were cited in that article that are more on the Department of Energy side. We'd be happy to provide you an update on the status of some of the pending applications.
Great. Thank you, and I yield back out of time.
Thank you.
Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. I want to address something that we've talked about before, and that is the Federal Highway Administration's proposed greenhouse gas emissions performance measure to force state departments of transportation and metropolitan planning organizations to cut carbon emissions stemming from transportation on the national highway system. You know, I've voiced my concerns about this in opposition to this proposal, which demonstrably exceeds the administration's authority. The policy was specifically considered and disposed of during negotiation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The Federal Highway Administration announced its final rule last November despite not having an authority to do so, and as a result, 22 states sued as part of 2 separate lawsuits. This spring, 2 federal courts found that the rule exceeds the Federal Highway's statutory authority. Yet now we learn that you're going to appeal that ruling. Can you tell us why? Why are you squandering time and resources to appeal a decision that's been adjudicated in court, and clearly you had no authority to make that rule? So explain that, if you would.
Sure. I'm not going to comment on our courtroom strategy. What I will say is
I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for the sense behind why you're challenging the ruling when you clearly didn't have the authority.
We don't believe that that's accurate. And of course, we will comply with any and all relevant court rulings. That's what we're doing in the meantime.
Let me ask you this. How much is this setting you back? And by you, I mean the Department of Transportation, and by Department of Transportation, I mean the American taxpayer. How much is this costing?
I haven't seen a costing in terms of hours of work spent on this.
That's a shame. You know, you got $661 billion to the Department of Transportation in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, $661 billion. And the things that we should be focusing on, like, for example, parking spaces for truck drivers.
I'm glad you raised that. As you probably know, we're building parking spaces for truck drivers.
Instead of spending the money on parking spaces, you're spending the money on appeals in the court system.
The grant programs for parking spaces don't come out of the same part of the budget as lawyers working on appeals, Congressman.
You really think it's a good allocation of taxpayer resources to challenge a legal decision for which you had no authority to make a rule on?
Yes, anything we do we think is a good allocation of taxpayer resources. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it.
Well, I guess the taxpayers probably feel differently about it, because I hear about this all the time from folks in my district that actually build the highways. See, we're responsible for paying for the highways. You're responsible for making sure they're getting done, but the people who actually do the work, they got a problem with this. Let me turn to another matter. Since I was first elected to Congress, I've worked to improve the safety of our nation's roadways. The American public should remain confident that our professional commercial motor vehicle drivers are operating safely throughout the country. In 2011, I introduced the Safe Roads Act, which was incorporated in MAP 21, and the creation of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's National Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. My Drug-Free Commercial Driver Act, which was included in the FAST Act, would allow hair testing for CMV drivers, which is a much better way to ensure that habitual drug users are not operating in safety-critical roles. The Department of Health and Human Services continues to fail to implement that requirement. I'm going to continue to remind them to do their job. The Department of Justice just published a rulemaking seeking to reclassify marijuana from Schedule 1 narcotic to Schedule 3. Under current law, trucking and other safety-critical transportation workers are required to be tested for certain drugs, including marijuana. Marijuana continues to be the drug most frequently seen by CMV drivers in their testing, reported to FMCA Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. The rescheduling And deregulation of marijuana would inevitably cause the number of people driving impaired while high to grow. The American Trucking Association has transmitted 2 letters to your agency highlighting these concerns. I would ask to unanimous consent to submit those into the record. Mr. Secretary, I think it's safe to assume that, the number of all impaired drivers on our roadways would increase with that ruling. Can you speak to what your department's doing to ensure that transportation workers in safety-reliant positions can continue to be tested for marijuana use if this proposal goes forward, and how your department plans to address transportation safety in light of DOJ's rulemaking?
Thank you. Yes, any impaired driving, be it alcohol, marijuana, or any other source of impairment, is of course a major safety concern. Our understanding of the rescheduling of marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 is that it would not alter DOT's marijuana testing requirements with respect to the regulated community. For private individuals who are performing safety-sensitive functions subject to drug testing, marijuana is identified by name, not by reference to one of those classes. So even if it moves in its classification, we do not believe that that would have a direct impact on that authority. Likewise, I should mention for federal employees, including any DOT employees who have a security clearance or a safety-sensitive position, we do not understand that to be changed, any drug testing requirement relevant to that, to be changed based on the reclassification decision. But we're continuing to evaluate any indirect impacts that it might have.
Thanks. Go back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Graves is recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. It's nice to see you again. I want to raise 3 things with you. Number one, an issue you and I have talked about both at hearings and otherwise, just concerns about the impact of the IIJA when considering things like inflation, supply chain, and construction costs. As a matter of fact, analysis by Federal Highway Administration shows that from when the Biden administration came in till now, we've seen about a 69% increase in cost of construction. And at home, that is on the lower end of what we've seen. We've seen projects come in substantially higher. I think when you add in the regulatory agenda of the administration, you're seeing delays. And as you know, the burn rate of the IIJA dollars is not really appropriate. It's not as fast as I know you'd like to see it. It's not as fast as I'd like to see it. And I think the regulatory agenda, by heaping all of these new regulations, particularly in the environmental space, is slowing things down. So I want to read a quote from our former Democrat governor who just left office in January. He said, "We're slated to receive at $6 billion from that act," meaning the IIJA, over 5 years for traditional infrastructure-related service transportation, and that's going to be very helpful. But we also have to manage expectations. Of that $6 billion, $5 billion we were going to get anyway. So the additional funding is about $200 million a year. Again, that's very helpful, but there are a lot of people who think that the $6 billion is on top of the base funding. It's not. And in exchange for the $200 million we're going to get each year, our match obligation's going to be going up by about $50 million. And so again, the governor of Louisiana, former governor of Louisiana, is saying $200 million a year. You have an inflation rate, again, adding 69% in there. You do the math, that means that Louisiana is actually getting behind, not getting ahead in terms of the legislation, which I know is not an objective that you or I would like to see. Secondly, I've raised with you a number of times the criteria that we have concerns with where you came in and unilaterally, without statutory action, said that in all of your grants, you're going to consider climate change, racial equity, environmental justice, and enhancing union opportunities, criteria that I have concerns with because of the lack of metrics or specificity. And so translating that into impacts on the state that I represent, Louisiana, according to analysis by Politico, we are one of the 5th worst states per capita, one of the 5th worst states per capita in terms of receiving funding under the legislation. Concerning because a bridge program that former Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney and I wrote is in there that we thought was actually going to help our state. Concerning because some of the PROTECT Act programs that we also were involved in drafting is in there. Louisiana got zero out of that one, which is designed for adaptation and resiliency. So very, very concerned about what I tell people in Louisiana when folks look at IIJA and expecting it to be positive, whenever the inflation rate results in it actually not being helpful. The regulations are making it difficult to actually execute, which I know aren't all your issue, other agencies giving you environmental obligations. And then at the end of the day, when our home state is one of the 5th worst performers in the country in terms of a per capita receipt, it's very, very concerning. And then the last thing, if in the 90 seconds I'm giving you, if you could just give us a little bit of advice on your thoughts on how we address this growing deficiency in the Highway Trust Fund with the user fee being a static 1993 figure.
I'll do my best to cover that in a short amount of time. I'll start with a point of agreement, which is I think the environment we have with cost escalation just increases the pressure to get projects delivered quickly, get grant agreements signed quickly, and really improve on the pace that, I should note, is the pace that we inherited, where it's just considered typical to take a year or two. Now, sometimes the project isn't ready to go, but we want to help them get ready to go. I do think that suggesting that the cost escalation can be attributed to the administration's measures flies in the face of the data showing commensurate cost escalations in every developed economy in this sector, although maybe we could unpack that to see at a more granular level how it's affecting a particular region. Certainly want to work with project sponsors in Louisiana to build on the successes that have happened with Lake Charles, I-10, Lake Calcasieu, the natural gas distribution infrastructure, $10 million that came to your district, and the areas where they have been ferries and other areas where Louisiana has been successful. We want every state to succeed as much as possible in getting those projects done that might not have happened otherwise. I won't claim to have a magic solution on the Highway Trust Fund, but I join you in being concerned about it. I think by the time of the 2026 vote on a future, or potential vote on a future reauthorization, that question will really come to a head, and Congress will need to decide whether the user pays principle is the future, or whether to continue turning to other sources of funding to fund our roads.
Before I yield back, I just want to commend you. I saw your 3-mile time on the race that you did recently. It looks like your running is getting a good bit better, and just want to congratulate you.
Appreciate you. I was huffing and puffing there, but we made it.
Gentleman yields back. Mr.
Convening the previously recessed hearing. As a reminder, members should limit their remarks to the allotted 5 minutes. With that, I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. And Secretary Buttigieg, I'm hearing from constituents that they are concerned about a potential port strike across the entire East and Gulf Coast ports if a contract agreement is not reached by September 30th. This will be devastating for Arkansas businesses that rely on the ports to move their import and exports to customers. We're 90 days out, and I've learned that the negotiations have been called off. This is alarming, and it's up to the Biden administration to bring the parties back to the table to avert this economic catastrophe in September. What are your plans to make sure a port strike doesn't happen?
Thank you. Yes, this is something we are monitoring closely, and our message to the parties is that it is vital that they come together and arrive at a deal that does right by port workers and allows port operations to flow. We had a similar level of intense negotiations around the West Coast ports with ILWU. That came to a successful conclusion. Our hope is that the same will take place with ILA, and I'm in frequent discussion with the Acting Secretary of Labor and other administration members on what we can do to urge the parties.
You're optimistic there's not going to be a shutdown, because people have to plan way in advance for alternate routes and things. So,
yeah, we can't speak for the parties, but of course we are urging them to get to a deal before that September 30th date.
Good. So earlier this year, the Federal Highway Administration issued a proposed rule that would waive federal regulations governing the procurement and administration of engineering and design services by local governments. Now, I've heard serious concerns from engineering companies about the potential impact of this change, which could undermine the long-standing and successful qualifications-based selection process that has been the federal standard for decades. I appreciate the department's interest in easing administrative burdens on local governments that receive federal grants, but as a professional engineer, and I think maybe the only one in Congress, I'm concerned about the potential drawbacks of this particular proposal. Studies have shown that hiring most qualified engineering companies saves time and money and results in better projects and more satisfied owners. The QBS method also gives small and minority-owned firms an even playing field to compete based on their specific proficiencies. It's my understanding that more than 740 public comments were filed in nearly unanimous opposition to the FHWA proposal. Can you please ensure that the administration will carefully consider the views of the engineering community and the potential negative impact of the proposed rule on public safety and project cost?
Yes, I'll take care to look into that, and we want to make sure that anything we do that affects the relationships with the engineering community is responsible and conducive to good, effective, safe project delivery.
And I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about carbon emissions, carbon reductions. I know that's something that you care about. And can you tell us what percentage of the world's carbon emissions does the U.S. produce?
I think it's less than a fifth, depending how you count it, of which the single biggest economic sector is transportation.
Right, so the government data says 13.49, 13.5% is from the U.S. And like you said, the biggest sector is transportation. What's the percentage of that?
I don't have that off the top of my head.
29%. So if we take 29% of 13.5%, that gets us down to between 3 and 4% of global emissions come from U.S. transportation. What percentage of that is passenger cars and light-duty vehicles?
So I know it's one of the single largest categories. I don't have a
About
percentage breakout for you.
57% of that. So if we take 57% of that second number, we're down around 2%. So if every internal combustion engine vehicle in the United States was magically converted to an EV overnight, what would that say the potential to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions would be?
By that logic, Congressman, none of us should ever vote. We are all doing our part to do something about a global change, and I believe America should lead the world.
I disagree with you on that. We should vote smartly. We should put smart policy in place. And last count, we tried to find the number, over 120 some odd billion taxpayer dollars have been put in subsidies for EVs. Now, that's if all the fuel going into these EVs came from non-carbon emitting sources. Do you know how much electricity in the United States comes from non-carbon emitting sources?
Even if all of that electricity came from fossil sources, it would still be cleaner because EV engines are more efficient.
I think you need to go back and look at physics a little bit.
Okay, the physics, Congressman, are that an EV engine is 90% efficient, where even the best ICE engines are lucky to get to 40%.
But the plant that made the energy is not 90% efficient, and internal combustion engines are 25 to 30% efficient, but you've got the efficiency of the generating plant plus the losses in transmission, and don't try to make the efficiency argument. The bottom line is...
Well, I'm definitely going to try to make the efficiency argument because I think it's important.
Well, use good data if you're going to do that.
Sure. Well, the good data is that between the regenerative braking and the 77%
you're talking about once the
energy's in the about 90%.
Once the energy's in the EV. But the bottom line is only 40% of energy in the United States comes from non-carbon emitting sources. So that 2%, if you can make every vehicle in the United States an EV overnight, you would be less than 0.9% of world's global greenhouse gas emissions. We're creating great turmoil and change in our country with taxpayer dollars that are being spent inefficiently. I'm all for EVs, but let the technology catch up and don't try to ban internal combustion engines at the rate that you're doing. I'm out of time, and yield back and recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
Secretary Buttigieg, you have recently, just earlier today, you've answered a lot of questions related to the slow implementation of the EV charging stations. And one of the conversations that you had, I thought was concerning, and I want to kind of touch upon it, was the statement that this push towards electric vehicles, even though there's a cost of slave labor, and that we're seeing, and it's not just cobalt. We've got lithium and other items that are being supplied by, 90% of it is coming from China. So we're empowering someone who's an aggressor to the United States. And yet, you're saying that it's fine so long as we're saving lives in America.
That's not an accurate characterization of what I've said. We wish you would have supported us in moving more of this onshore so it'd be produced in America, but the legislation did pass. And to take graphite alone, we're going to be able to supply, we estimate, 47% of it domestically. Nobody believes in allowing any product that doesn't meet labor standards to be imported to the United States. And if you'd like to work with us on making sure any of the 159 items of concern to include cobalt can be better enforced, we'd welcome that.
Your view that it saves lives.
We believe that preventing harmful pollution, well, we don't believe, it is a fact that preventing harmful pollution in the U.S. will save lives.
Have you done any calculations, given the current rate of fires that occur, and these fires, as reports indicate, take hundreds of thousands of liters of water to extinguish when an electric vehicle catches fire. Do you have any research that indicates how many people might die from some of these fires?
I haven't seen a projection of that. I'm sure you're aware that flammable liquids are also a safety concern, and either way, we work to make sure that they are handled in a safe fashion.
We're not seeing the reports of vehicles, like an epidemic of regular gasoline vehicles catching fire.
You're not?
Across the United States.
You've never heard of gasoline fires
Does it
in
take
vehicles?
150,000 liters of water to put out?
Are you familiar with what happened to the I-95 bridge? Let me assure you that the use of flammable liquids to propel hundreds of millions of vehicles includes hazards. Let me also make you aware that the American Chemical Society estimates that 9,700 Americans a year die from the pollution associated with passenger vehicle use in this country.
Let me ask this question. There's been reports of individuals who have been locked in an electric vehicle. There was a recent story. Renee Sanchez found her 20-month-old granddaughter stuck in an electric vehicle in the heat. The battery had died, and they couldn't get the child out. They had to call and get firefighters to come break the glass in order to get the child out. Just recently, last year, Secretary Granholm had an embarrassing incident where she had a PR tour that went south, was promoting electric vehicles and that push, driving across the country in electric vehicles. Apparently, she had an advance team that was in a gas-powered vehicle. That advance team occupied the charging station, the one charging station that a family needed, causing who had an infant, that family to have to call 911 so that they could make sure that they were able to provide some kind of care for their infant child in that heat.
I imagine you're aware that the number of publicly available chargers has nearly doubled since we took office, and we're investing to fill in the gaps. Now, 80% plus of charging happens at home, but for the rest of it, that's where those public chargers are so important. But we've just never been the kind of country that holds on to old technology because we're working on problems with the new technology.
You see my point? The American people are seeing what's happening, and they have serious concerns, and yet we're pushing ever more in this direction. And I don't know that we're actually taking into consideration the human costs that these are also bringing with them. The potential for batteries to die, people to be stranded in places without air conditioning, without support. And I would think that your administration would want to have those facts as well. How many people might die because of fires occurring from these batteries?
A battery dying is a problem, just like running out of gas is a problem, which is why we're investing in addressing that. I've just never thought of that as an excuse to hang on to dirty and expensive fuels and old technology.
Well, the American people disagree. They do.
Well, no, the American people disagree with you because every year they buy more EVs.
No,
why do you think they're buying more EVs every year than before?
Because present the numbers, because every...
Sure, 1.2 million vehicles were purchased last year, and every single quarter...
how many of them were government?
How's that?
How many of them were purchased by the government?
Approximately 0.5%.
Of the number, you're saying...
Of the EVs, about 0.5% were purchased by the federal government.
The only reason why people are buying them is because of the subsidy.
Well, the subsidy makes them more affordable and helps people buy them. That's true.
Thank you. My time has expired.
The gentleman yields. Mr. LaMalfa is recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary, thank you for appearing with us here today once again. Appreciate it. Let's see. So on electric vehicles and the chargers, in the infrastructure bill a while back, there was $7.5 billion put forth for that. $5 billion that was allocated to states individually to build their own networks with that seed money. So the report I have is that since then, we've seen an intense amount of money go out, but we've only accomplished approximately 7 charging stations spread amongst 4 states. So we have this term investment that doesn't seem to be hitting much of a goal, as people are still frustrated with the electric vehicle owners we have still seem to have a lot of challenges finding what they need in order to go more than 30 miles from home, for example. So, and then the nature of the EV stations themselves they're exempted from the Buy America provisions. So we're buying these components from China and other overseas. So that's disturbing, because we should be building it here when we are, and we would have the ability, which leads to a couple more questions, but Secretary, with my understanding there's another $1.3 billion that was added to that initial 7.5. Why are we doubling down on more when the performance so far has been basically only 7 stations?
Well, so to be clear, there are 186,000 public chargers across the United States. That's about double what it was when President Biden arrived. Most of those have been put in by the private sector, but we believe that public sector involvement is necessary to build out the rest of the network, hence the NEVI program that you referred to. That program is intended to install tens of thousands of chargers in the second half of this decade, and we've already had 38 of the states that we're providing funding to release their solicitations for the program. We're even going to see the first few hundred of those chargers installed this year. As you mentioned, there's even a tiny handful that are up and running today, but I want to emphasize our expectations have been that the peak year for installation would be 27 or 28, because this is a totally new program for the states. I do want to emphasize also that this charging program is subject to Build America, Buy America provisions. There is flexibility in that to recognize the fact that we're standing up what's effectively a new industry in the United States. But we're committed to making sure that that new American industry is homegrown, is creating jobs right here on U.S. soil. And as the states work toward their procurement, we think we're going to really see that demand signal lead to a burgeoning of that industry here in the United States of America.
The difficulty of the Buy American is that we don't seem to be able to produce in this country. Well, the mined raw materials have to come from somewhere else, and then the manufacturing pretty much stays in those other areas, and so we're not doing well at Buy American on what comes from the mines as well as the finished products. So
well, that's a big part of what we're changing through the President's initiatives. DOE now estimates, with the new awards, for example, for producing a domestic battery supply chain, that we will have enough graphite to support 47% of the U.S. demand domestically. We're also working on partnerships with friendly countries so that when we do need to turn abroad for materials or refinement, we're not necessarily turning to places like China. And increasingly, recycling will be important.
Well, let me drill down on that.
Some of these materials live indefinitely.
Thank you. Let me drill down on that. Would you be part of a group of voices that would say we need to mine these products in this country instead of somewhere else?
Certainly would prefer that they be sourced domestically.
Okay, thank you. On the EVs themselves, now we're seeing that there seems to be a turning around of attitude on that. Like Ford Motor Company, they lost $4.5 billion on them. They're down. They're bringing down the price of their electric pickup quite a bit, which that's probably going to be a loser for them. I don't know. And they're letting their dealers off the hook from having to install hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of infrastructure to be EV dealerships. So you see a retraction of that, as well as 7 in 10 Americans said they don't not want to buy an EV because it takes the charging isn't there, the battery technology. And then current EV owners, half of them are considering switching back to gas vehicles. So shouldn't we be tailoring it to people that want them? It seemed like 10 or 15% instead of forcing people up to, a complete ban by 2035 like California's talking?
Well, one of the reasons that we have not forced anyone to purchase any particular vehicle is we want this to be led by consumers making choices. And consumers are choosing EVs more every single year than they did the previous year. And I think that reflects the fact that as the prices come down, more and more Americans decide it's the right answer for them.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
One more question, in, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you.
The
More to
vote-
follow
the
to
vote has
Secretary Buttigieg. Thank you for coming, Secretary. I appreciate your coming and testifying, and it's always good to see you and discuss America's needs and Memphis's needs, which are America's needs, as you well know. Your department and your leadership have made tireless efforts and been instrumental in advancing our infrastructure. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we've had most significant investment in infrastructure in decades, addressing critical needs in our roads, bridges, transit systems, and more. I thank you and President Biden and those that voted for this bill. Several discretionary grant programs, such as the Rebuilding America Infrastructure and Sustainability Equity discretionary grant program, RAISE, important. Just funded a program, which I appreciated in my district, that completed the Wolf River Greenway, a 26-mile pedestrian and bicycle path that needed to be completed, and it's a great opportunity for people to get exercise and get away from some communities and get into a better natural surroundings. And we passed almost unanimously, not unanimously, with great bipartisan support, the FAA reauthorization. Those improvements were needed yesterday, but we've got them now. Let me ask you about the I-55 bridge. I know you've heard from multiple stakeholders in my district about the bridge investment program to replace the I-55 bridge. Only 2 bridges cross the Mississippi River in Memphis, one of which you came to Memphis to see, the I-40, when it was closed for several months because of problems and basically caused by Arkansas not expecting it well. But now it's clear we need a new bridge. This was built at a time when there were not, before the interstate highway system, so it didn't have any interstate highway levels of protection and stats, and it was before we had seismic vulnerabilities for older bridges. The bridge investment program is very competitive, I understand, but this is an important bridge for America. Can you give me any idea of when the FHWA ratings will be shared with applicants and when funding might be announced?
Thank you. As you noted, I had an opportunity to see for myself the critical importance of the I-55 bridge, both for individuals and for America's supply chains. And we're conscious that that bridge project has approached the department in the bridge investment program. Right now, Federal Highway is going through its process with a preliminary review and rating, and then a dialogue with applicants that gives them an opportunity to supplement their applications based on anything they've learned. We reached out to Tennessee's DOT earlier this year to provide some of that feedback and then continue that process. I also want to note that any highly recommended or recommended bridge project application that doesn't give an award in the year when it comes in will be automatically carried forward for consideration under the next fiscal year unless they opt out. In terms of timing, we're working through it right now for the 23-24 cycle, hoping to make a round of awards later on this summer, and again, very conscious of the importance of that particular opportunity for the community in the region.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Passenger rights has been an important part of my service on this committee, and I know you've done a lot with it, and I thank you for your recent rules on fee transparency and cash refunds for flight cancellations. What do the implementation timelines and enforcement of these rules look like?
So the rulemakings each have their own clock, typically 6 months or less to comply, although I will note that the refund provisions that were included in the FAA reauthorization go into effect right away. And so it's simply a matter of us aligning the mechanisms to be able to do so, which we're working to do promptly. We are proud of our record on passenger protection. We know there's always more work to do as well. And so we're continuing rulemakings on topics like making sure that you don't have to pay extra to sit next to your kid on a flight, and looking into the issue of compensating passengers for extreme delays, in addition
extra
to
for not sitting next to somebody else's kid? Let me ask you about the airplane seat sizes, which is something I've worked on for many, many years. They've gotten smaller and more crowded. There were 26,000 comments about the discomfort of current seat sizes. Given your recent efforts to improve the passenger experience, nothing could be more important than a comfortable seat. Can you assure us that seat width and pitch will not get smaller?
We continue to assess what our authorities might be in this regard. I can certainly assure you as a frequent flyer that I've experienced the squeeze you're describing. Of course, in order for us to undertake regulatory action, it would need to align with one of our statutory authorities. FAA has looked into some of the safety implications of that.
Let me just ask you this. When they do the study, last time they didn't have anybody over 60 or 65 and nobody under 18, nobody with a disability, nobody with a dog. Can you make sure it looks like the flying public? That was an absurd test they did.
We're conscious of the limitations under the study that was run before, and we'll certainly hold that in mind in going into any future study.
My last thing, to throw it out, safe streets. Memphis was unfortunately first in pedestrian deaths, and we need more safe streets money. And we want to, I know you're dying to ride the train from Memphis to Nashville to Atlanta, and I look forward to doing it with you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Likewise.
Before we begin with members' questions, I do want to flag that we anticipate two vote series today. The first one starting at 10:30, and the secretary has a hard stop. So what I'm asking is let's be respectful of the secretary's time and try to keep our questions to 5 minutes. Stay underneath your, underneath our rules. So with that, I'm going to turn to Ranking Member Larson for opening questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for coming today. I appreciate it. There's a lot of math out there in terms of how much you've spent, how much hasn't been spent, what's going on. By my math, we're about 52.8% of the way in terms of timeline to September 30th, 2026. Also by my math, the DOT has distributed about 48.1% of the dollars. So pretty close, not exact, but pretty close, almost half and half. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges you've had getting dollars out the door and what you've done to address those challenges so communities can benefit from the dollars in the BIL?
Thank you. Yes, as you noted, we are more or less right in the middle of the 5-year life of this authorization, and depending how you measure, but by the most basic measure of funds flowing out, we've made roughly half of the funding available. As you know, our funding works typically on a reimbursement basis, which means not only do we have to announce an award, but there needs to be an agreement making clear that federal requirements have been met for that project. Then the project sponsor needs to undertake it, and then the dollars can be fully outlaid after obligation. But we've been trying to work within that to try to create flexibility where appropriate with tools like pre-award authority so that work can begin if again, appropriate and if the right checks and balances are there. We want to make sure that process is never a barrier to things getting done. There are a lot of challenges along the way. The complexity of the projects, supply chain and workforce challenges given the enormous volume of work that we're doing. And while the overall number from the best data that I can gather, the overall number of projects delivered now is on par with what we would have seen at this point in a previous administration. We really want to accelerate and compress the timelines, especially the time between an award announcement and a grant agreement. We've stood up teams that I personally engage with and do a great deal of work under the hood to try to speed up those processes.
Are there specific actions that you can outline for us that you have taken with regards to that process?
Yeah, I would point to the Center of Excellence that we have established on project delivery. We brought some of the best talent and some of the best data that we have to try to get that done. We've used steps like programmatic approaches and sometimes combined NOFOs in order to have less red tape and fewer steps associated with the same number of projects. We've also undertaken a new level of technical assistance with our grant sponsors, because often it's the first time that they've done a federal grant of this magnitude, especially the rural and tribal communities that we've been working with. And so through both structured programs like the Thriving Communities Program and just our running capacity for technical assistance, we're standing side by side with our project sponsors. The instructions I've given to our team is, even if the delay in some federal process is coming from the state or the county or the city not yet being ready with something, we should take ownership of that. We should take responsibility for that, and not just say, it's your problem, you fix it. We're going to be side by side with you, helping you navigate these processes, even while we're working to make them simpler on the front end, which begins just with my quest to get NOFOs below 100 pages, which is actually was not the norm we inherited. But it's just one small example of what we're trying to do to make this a more user-friendly federal grant process.
Thanks. Can I move to rail safety? And now that the NTSB had their hearing Tuesday, the report is out. I think we're briefed tomorrow morning on the report, if I'm not mistaken, here on the committee. Has the department looked at specific actions, legislative actions that we need to take versus any regulatory actions that the department can take?
We've undertaken a number of regulatory actions, but of course are assessing the recommendations that have been made public, even though they haven't been formally transmitted yet to us as a department, to make sure that we're doing everything we can within our existing regulatory authority to keep freight rail safe. But the reality is, while we're going to keep doing everything we can short of an act of Congress, it's going to take an act of Congress to give us some of the tools that we need. I would point to two things in particular that I think are important that are contemplated in the bipartisan legislation that has been put forward and that we urge this committee and this chamber to act on. One has to do with increasing the statutory caps on fines to put more teeth in our enforcement. Right now, they're capped in the neighborhood of $220,000, which just isn't that much to a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Another thing I would point to is the acceleration of the adoption of DOT 117 tank cars, which the FAST Act set at 2029, later than what the department had planned on previous to that congressional intervention. My understanding of the information that's been made public by the NTSB is if those tank cars had been in use, what happened in East Palestine might not have.
All right. Thank you. Yield.
The gentleman yields. Ms. Titus is recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, it's nice to see you again. Thank you for your patience and waiting for us to come back to vote. It was great to have you in District 1 as we announced the speed train to California. That's going to create a lot of good union jobs, and it's going to be funded right out of that bipartisan infrastructure law. So thank you for working with us on that. You know, you've heard from many of my colleagues, and I agree with them, that Boeing's safety track record is a problem. In fact, I saw a cartoon in the paper the other day that said that airlines were given extra mileage points if you'd sit in the exit row and hold the door on during the flight. That is not the image that we want to project, because we've always been the leader in safety. But another safety issue that I wish you would address is the number of air traffic controllers. I've heard you say that it's a problem. We have a real shortage. There's a hiring target of 2,000 in the fiscal year 2025. I worked with Mr. Yackham on an amendment to the FAA bill to do maximum hiring through the FAA Academy. Could you talk about those deadlines and if there's anything we need to do to help the Academy with resources or changes that will help us to try to catch up to this shortage?
Thank you for your attention to this issue. We share that concern. Over many, many years, the number of air traffic controllers qualified and working has gone down. The good news is that's finally stabilized and begun to go up a little bit, but the problem is we need it to go up much more quickly. In order to do that, we've requested, as you mentioned, funding for to hire 2,000 in the coming fiscal year. We would welcome your support for that funding. We've also worked to increase the what we call the force multiplier of CTI, collegiate training initiatives that can work alongside, never at the expense of, but alongside our excellent facility in Oklahoma City to help get more controllers qualified quickly. And certainly eager to continue working with you both to implement all the provisions of the FAA reauthorization and just to make sure that the funding and the recruiting stays on pace.
I was going to ask you about the recruiting. How have you beefed that up? Where do you recruit? With whom do you recruit?
So we get a remarkable number of applicants every time we open a cycle, and we're encouraging people from all walks of life to consider a career that can be rewarding and lucrative. It's very rigorous, though, and not everybody who comes through the door even makes it through the first few steps. Of course, that rigor is a good thing, and I should assure you none of the measures we're taking involve reducing that high bar of qualification, but we do want to make sure we support those applicants and help them meet those high bars so that they can have a great career and we can have the numbers we need in our air traffic control workforce.
Well, thank you for that. If I can shift gears a little bit to the drone industry, domestic drone industry, and the rulemaking that it's occurred in the past for the line of sight issue. You had 90 experts who submitted a report saying we need to do this, and made some recommendations to the FAA. A rule was put forward. I worked with Mr. Graves, who chaired the Aviation Subcommittee, hoping to get something by September. Can you tell us kind of how that process is going? Will you meet the deadline? Are there any problems we need to address?
We certainly understand the importance of that rulemaking. There's complexity in this, the novelty of this issue. We also see the growth of these drones, and we know there's going to be more and more of them entering the national airspace. So I know the team is hard at work at that. I'll try to get you more of an update. We are conscious of the reauthorization provision, creating a time frame for that work to get completed.
I just don't want to see us fall further and further behind other places, Europe, Australia.
Understood.
Well, thank you. If you'll let me know, I appreciate it.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes Mr. Allred for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us again. I appreciate your patience today. I want to thank you for your continued support in getting the IIJA funding out of D.C. and into our communities. This legislation has had a significant impact in North Texas and will continue to shape our community for years to come. In fact, you just mentioned low-emission buses. In June of last year, DART, the Dallas Area Rapid Transit Agency, received a $103 million federal transit grant to help us modernize our bus fleet. In March of this year, the Southern Gateway Park and Clyde Warren Park and other North Texas projects received $80 million in funding from USDOT, thanks to grants as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the IIJA. But one project that you and I have discussed several times in this setting that I'd like to highlight is Amtrak's partnership with Texas Central to develop a high-speed rail connecting Dallas and Houston, two of the largest metropolitan areas in Texas and the country. In December of 23, the project was awarded a $500,000 grant as part of the Corridor ID program funded through the IIJA, and this now public-private partnership, I think, is a great example of this administration's and our commitment to environmentally sustainable transportation while simultaneously supporting economic growth. And so you talked a bit about this when you were last in Dallas on TV, but here, could you just mention a little bit about how serious your agency is and you are about high-speed rail in Texas?
Thank you. We are enthusiastic about the potential, and the funding that comes with this corridor ID designation is both direct funding for planning activities and a signal of the potential that we see. When you look across the geography of the United States, the best candidates for high-speed rail service are geographies where you have two major metropolitan areas that are fairly close to each other, but really a short flight that borders on the realm of impracticality, or a long drive that also borders on the realm of impracticality. And creating that third option of a good high-speed ride can, we think, unlock enormous economic potential, and even for the people who don't use it, bring benefits in the form of reduced congestion on those roadways and those airports. So we look forward to seeing this proposal continue to develop, and I would be surprised if it did not lead to more applications for support as the vision continues to take shape.
I think that's right. And you mentioned, of course, reducing congestion. I have made that drive many times from Dallas and Houston. It's not an easy drive. The flight is not always the most convenient option. To me, this would just spur so much economic growth, and it's a common sense idea. But there's also the technology involved in it that I just wanted to briefly discuss, which is, I think it's the Shinkansen bullet train, which is made in Japan. It's the world's safest transportation technology, really, in many ways, operating without a fatality since 1964. Can you speak about your experience with this technology? And I understand that you might have had a chance to ride on one of these.
Yes, I had the privilege of riding on the Shinkansen train in Japan when I was attending the G7 meetings hosted by Japan last year for transportation ministers and my counterparts. It was an extraordinary experience, especially sitting up in that cab where I had an opportunity to observe the operator and seeing the operations center behind the scenes where they conduct those safe and efficient operations. It is rare for them to be more than a few seconds at variance from their published schedule. And as you mentioned, in a technology in a train going back to the 60s, they have an unbelievable safety record too. I think any American who sees that comes home and says, why can't we have something like this? And I think that's the kind of quality and the kind of efficiency that we should aspire to here in the U.S.
I am convinced that if we get one of these lines in Texas, we will get more. We are a perfect candidate for this. And really quickly, in the last 30 seconds I have here, I just want to commend you as the father of 2 small kids. I know your growing family, and to highlight the fact that passengers will no longer have to pay more to sit next to their kids on flights. To me, this is just common sense, but it's the kind of thing that really can make an impact in people's lives. And I think it's an example of your leadership. And at some point in our next discussion, I'd love to talk to you about our air traffic controllers and how this FAA bill is going to help us restore that workforce. But with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Duarte is recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. You've testified today on the topic of EVs that there is no mandate. You've said that we have not forced anyone to purchase any particular vehicle. You've testified that you want power to be in the hands of consumers. Is that a fair characterization of your testimony?
That we don't have an EV mandate? That's correct.
That's correct. Okay, so I'm of a similar view. I don't think that I'm all for EVs. I have a lot of constituents who buy them. And I think that you're right that there will be an increasing adoption of them going forward. However, I support the right of consumers to make their own choice. So it sounds like we're on the same page there. So do you, like me, then oppose California's effort to take that choice away from consumers by banning gas-powered vehicles?
We respect that states can make their own decisions about state policies, but at a federal level, our approach has to do with economic incentives and support for chargers, not any kind of mandate coming out of the DOT on what technology you're supposed to buy for your vehicle.
Sure, but you've said you support giving choice to consumers. Now you've said you support giving choice to states, but those two are conflicting because the state is taking that right away from consumers. So why is it that you side with giving the state the choice as opposed to giving the consumer the choice?
Because this is federal policy. I make federal policy, and our federal policy is to support consumer choice. But look, sometimes our federal policy is a floor, and states decide to go above and beyond that.
But as you're aware, the federal government has actually given California the authority to issue that ban through a waiver under the Clean Air Act. So do you support the conferral of that waiver?
I think that's on the EPA side of the house, so I want to make sure that I'm conscious of the
understand.
jurisdictional differences. But I'm not informed enough on EPA's processes to weigh in on their policy choices. What I'll say again is that at the federal level in the Biden-Harris administration, our strategy with regard to EVs is to make sure there's more chargers out there and to make them more affordable.
Sure, but I'm trying to parse out your position because on the one hand you say you favor giving consumers choice, and yet on the other hand, you seem to be standing behind an administration policy that is enabling the biggest state in the country to take that choice away. So which is it?
I'm talking about federal policy.
And
when I
federal
talk
policy
about
is
not
enabling
mandating.
this choice that now California is also bringing 18 other states along with.
Yeah, enabling, not requiring.
So do you support legislation to take that waiver away?
You mean federal legislation to preempt the ability of states to make their own decisions?
No,
As a
that's
general
not
rule,
correct.
no.
It's a special authority that's been granted to the states to make that decision. So
Mhm.
you're supporting granting special authority to ban gas-powered vehicles, correct?
States may seek waivers, and if they qualify under the law, we'll consider them. Again, I don't want to get into the weeds of something that another agency is doing because I'm not privy to all
But you are the
details
Secretary of
from the EPA side.
Transportation, and this is a massive question of transportation policy. So I was just wondering if you had a view, yes or no?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's many cases where states have led the way by going above and beyond a federal floor.
Sure. Let's turn to high-speed rail for a moment. Your administration has given, or your department has given $3.1 billion to this project recently. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the governor of California said this show of support from the Biden-Harris administration is a vote of confidence in today's vision for that project. Do you agree with that statement from Governor Newsom that you have your confidence in the current vision for California high-speed rail?
We don't approve awards for any project if we're not confident in the integrity of the application and the ability of the project sponsor to meet whatever is required for them through the application process.
But you are
and
aware
whatever
that the
said they
project
would
has
do.
been a nightmare in California, correct?
It's kind of a subjective question. What I'm aware of is it's creating a lot of good-paying jobs. It's taken a long time, and it's a
Well,
big
this is
investment.
actually the term the New York Times used in an article, How California's Bullet Train Went Off the Rails. It called it a multi-billion-dollar nightmare. The LA Times reported it's $100 billion short in funding right now, and the New York Times also said that it's not on track to be finished this century. That is not on track to be finished this century. Do you disagree?
I would be surprised if it took till the end of this century to deliver quality high-speed rail in California. So I suppose in that respect,
When do you think
I
it will
disagree.
be finished?
I didn't hear you, sorry.
When do you think it will be finished?
I have seen projections for when the Merced to Bakersfield segment will come online. We're looking into the next decade for sure for the bulk of the revenue service.
Okay, but you earlier stated in response to my colleague from California's questions that the sort of funding is predicated on it ultimately going from LA to San Francisco. So I'm asking, when do you think that will be completed?
I'm not going to get ahead of the High-Speed Rail Authority there on their latest projections for when future stages could
Well, no,
be
you've
completed.
already gotten there. You've given them $3.1 billion. So certainly you have some thought as to when
For the
this
Bakersfield
might
Merced
actually be of
segment.
some benefit to California consumers.
Well, obviously, the moment it's in revenue service, it's a benefit to some California
Right. So do you think
consumers.
it'll be before the century?
Yeah.
Do you think it'll be before the mid-century?
Yeah.
You do? Okay, so when? What's your best estimate for when we'll have operational high-speed rail from...
I'm not going to estimate a year for the San Francisco to LA corridor.
Okay. Do you think that the technology will still be state-of-the-art by the time it's complete?
I think the technology will be a lot better than what Americans are accustomed to today.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Ms. Sykes is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Larson, for holding this hearing, and of course, Secretary Buttigieg, for your testimony. I'm certainly going to piggyback a little bit of my colleague and continue to talk about rail safety. As you know, the East Palestine trail derailment happened just next door to my district, and we have been very much involved and engaged. Since we've heard from the NTSB, we have penned a letter to this committee, including to Chairman Nails, to hold a hearing on rail safety. I've signed that letter with my colleague, Nikema Williams from Georgia, who is also very interested in making sure that we are holding corporate actors accountable and protecting the safety and security of people across the nation. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your efforts in supporting bipartisan rail safety provisions and many of the things that we just heard about. I also want to say thank you for visiting Ohio's 13th district, the best district, of course, in the nation, as we all say, to highlight some of the local efforts to create workforce development opportunities, expand apprenticeships, and invest in infrastructure to lower costs. And none of these would be possible without the historic legislation like the bipartisan infrastructure law and the implementation work that you have done. We're very grateful for those funds that have made it to our communities, and a lot of people have gotten great jobs, union jobs especially, that pay well and are safe. But one thing that we didn't get to do in the district during your visit this week was visit our crown jewel, which we call the Akron-Canton Airport, which is CAK. They have received over $3 million in funding, and this airport was established during World War II and served as a vital asset for economic development in the community, and generated over $1 billion in the area and over 4,000 jobs. However, even with this type of activity and ridership, passenger rides, it has not protected this airport from threats faced by other small to mid-sized regional airports. So for example, CAK has seen major airlines consolidate their routes to Cleveland Hopkins, in part because CAK is designated within the Cleveland Airport as one market based on the Department of Transportation. And this designation has unfairly excluded CAK from the list of airports that require maximum air service levels and limits their ability to optimize their role as a key promoter of economic development. And this directly impacts my constituents because these were their jobs that now have moved. So, Mr. Secretary, how can airports like Akron-Canton distinguish itself as a unique standalone market when some of the decisions by agencies don't allow them to do so?
Well, first, let me thank you for welcoming us to the district. It was a very informative and inspiring visit. And also, let me thank you for your work on rail safety legislation that we are very hopeful gets quick action and results in this chamber. Having been the mayor of a city that had a small airport that was within driving distance of a big airport, but meant a lot to our community, I certainly understand and sympathize with the aspirations of Akron-Canton and want to make sure that airport gets the support that it needs and deserves. I know that we've been in dialogue with the airport about planned upgrades for the air traffic control tower there, but also understand that there is a level of market pressure that's affecting the region. While some of the ways that these radii are set up may be pursuant to statute. To the extent there's any flexibility, we'd welcome opportunities to work with you on that so that it really makes sense for the region, for the market, and for a community or a facility like Akron-Canton.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We have felt that the downside of the consolidations and larger airports, larger airlines, going way back to U.S. Air, American Airline, when we had Northwest, Delta, even with full flights, loyal customers and large populations based close to our airport, and really a segment of our rural communities really preferring this route, it has been very, very impactful. And so, again, we just want to work with you on that very specific need in our community. We do not want to see this airport go away. It would be negatively impact not just Northeast Ohio, my district, but the entire eastern region of the state that certainly needs a lot of love. But with that, Mr. Secretary, I promised you when you were in the district that we were going to be very positive and give you good vibes, because I do know that this can be tough sitting in meetings for several hours, and I'm going to yield back my final 13 seconds so you can take a breath. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative.
Minutes.
Hello, Secretary. Thank you for joining us here today. Last time we were here, we talked about two things. One was the high-speed rail in my project in my district, which is the California High-Speed Rail Project. The $128 billion high-speed rail project that was a state initiative that will move from Merced, a city of 60,000, down to Bakersfield, a city of approximately 350,000, I believe. Are those the type of metropolitan centers that you were just meaning to describe when you talked about the best candidates for high-speed rail?
On their own and in a vacuum, it is unlikely that they would generate that justification. But of course, that Merced to Bakersfield segment represents a step toward connecting two of the largest economic areas in the United States.
So after we've spent $128 billion going over flatland between Merced and Bakersfield, we'll then think about how we're going to get through the mountains and the urban areas of Los Angeles and the Bay Area to then finish the high-speed rail project someday in the distant future?
Well, the Bakersfield to Merced segment comes first. And yes, as I understand it, the vision of the project sponsors is ultimately to fully connect all the way through to the downtowns.
Are you
of those
capable
two regions.
of recognizing a hopeless boondoggle? Because that's what we're discussing right now.
I've seen a lot of the most compelling and ambitious human projects characterized as hopeless boondoggles during the time that they were taking shape. And I'm not surprised for a project that represents the first movement in the United States of America toward this kind of technology, that it has proven to present a lot of challenges for those first movers.
Thank you. Let's move on to something even more important, in my opinion. Representative Owens, a good friend of mine, earlier discussed the electric vehicle trade, the proxy imperialism that American taxpayers are sponsoring in the Congo in the pursuit of cobalt. I don't know, I guess God shined on us today, because just walking in the atrium of Rayburn Office Building here, we have a Congolese delegation talk about economic development in Congo. So I got a quote from Abraham Leno, who was sitting in here a little while ago, but his schedule does not permit for him to be here right now. Nonetheless, I'd encourage you to speak to him on your way through there today. Let me quote Abraham Leno. He actually provided me a quote that I'll read verbatim. Children are working in situations with exposure to chemicals like mercury and going into mines with no safety regulations or oversight. Beyond the daily tragedy, Congo is losing the productive labor force of the future and people who would contribute to a brighter future with a stronger civil society. I've read the book, or at least audiobooked, I'll admit, Cobalt Red. As you pursue these electric vehicle technologies, you call it technology, but technology in my book makes lives better. I don't see electric vehicles making lives tremendously better here in the United States. They're crushing lives around the world. We've got slave trade in Congo.
I just can't accept that that's a necessary consequence of newer technology.
Don't accept it. If you feel a glow driving an electric vehicle here today in America, go ahead and feel that. There are children in mines being crushed. There are families being broken. There are warlords forcing these people into slavery around the world.
And I trust anyone serious about confronting that will join us in enforcing our protections against forced and child labor.
That's
I
your
must
value
also
system.
say that I am puzzled to find people who have shown no interest in dealing with forced and child labor in any other product
You
suddenly
are
become
forcing
concerned
child
about
labor
it
in the Congo.
No.
It's documented. It's been known for decades. You want to talk about reparations. Your party wants to talk about proxy imperialism in our history. We are practicing imperialism today through the Chinese Communist government going in to extract
We're
the minerals
competing with the
necessary.
Chinese Communist government to build this on U.S. soil, and
You
we
are-
wish we
you
would
are
have your help on it.
subsidizing the Chinese government today.
We're
with your
subsidizing the American
EV.
auto industry.
You are subsidized. You are not going to tell me you believe. Go ahead. Tell me you believe that the majority of batteries produced for American EVs that are receiving federal subsidies today are being produced with constituents and components sourced in America and are slavery-free.
What I can tell you is that
No, that's a
today's
very
EV
simple statement. Do you believe the constituents and components in American electric vehicles being subsidized by our government today are slavery-free?
Here's what I can tell you. 80% less cobalt is going into today's EV batteries. Most of the cobalt that is used comes as a byproduct from nickel and copper mining, and major battery makers
So you
in
don't
the
want to
U.S.
discuss
such as, could you
slavery.
please let me
You'd
finish
No,
the
you're not
sentence?
finishing. I asked you about slavery. You're telling me about constituents and other components. Ask me, just answer the question I actually asked, which is, do you believe the electric vehicles being produced and subsidized by American taxpayers today are slavery-free, fair trade vehicles?
I should certainly hope that they are, and if there's any specific evidence of any violation of any provision to prevent forced and child labor of any product, any of the 159 products listed,
Will you speak to our
we
friends
will
from
work
Congo
on that.
out
Now,
here?
what I would also,
Will you
look,
speak to our friends
we
in
can do one
Congo
of,
out here in the atrium
I'm
today
just
on your way out?
astonished that people
Will
who
you
have
get a
shown
hold-
zero interest
Will
in
you-
confronting
will
forced
you-
or child labor on any of the other 158 products listed are suddenly terribly concerned about it on this one
We are
product, which we can
subsidizing
actually
this with
do
American
without that
taxpayers.
much
This isn't
cobalt.
just about unfair competition. This is about subsidizing child labor through American
Then why
policy
didn't you vote
in
for
our
the
treasury.
provision to
The
move it
time
onto
has
U.S.
expired.
soil?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
Yields. The chair recognizes Mr. Bost for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, with the higher demand of goods and services, many of the industries rely on freight trucks to deliver goods and service to the customers. The administration has focused a lot on rail transit and aviation within the budget requests, but continues to leave out some important things involving truck drivers, specifically truck parking. Now, while rail is vital in the rural areas of this nation rely on the delivery of those trucks, we have also seen an increase in the amount of women that are now driving, thank heaven. While the industry continues to grow, all of these trucks are struggling to find places to rest and then while trying to abide by the federal hours of service requirements. My legislation, the Truck Park Safety Improvement Act, addresses a shortfall on the truck parking to allow safe places for our drivers to take a break from the long road without fearing of accidents, assaults, or robberies. Now I'm asking about, and I asked about this topic last year and was told that the administration was working on the truck parking, and I was upset to see the budget request did not include anything regarding truck parking. What are you planning to do to address this issue? Because this issue came out, the first studies in 2002, how bad it is that we need truck parking.
Well, first of all, let me applaud your attention to the issue of truck parking and make clear that we are applying not just words, but dollars and cents to this issue. We've been able to fund projects in Wyoming, Tennessee, Florida, and other locations to support truck drivers. So I can assure you, even if it doesn't have its own line item, it is something that we consider important for a number of programs like infra, and also are urging our state partners to consider this as a use of their federal formula dollars and are encouraging them to remember that they have that flexibility. I spent some time just last week with truck drivers, including a number of women truck drivers who were pleased to see coming into that career. It remains as vital a career as ever, and we've got to make sure that we're supporting the drivers we count on in every way. We're taking a number of measures, including dealing with predatory leasing and towing, and encouraging veterans to get their costs paid for training, but certainly agree with you that parking is probably the number one issue we hear when we talk to drivers, and we're working on it.
If we can shift gears on my next question, the Attorney General is initiating a rulemaking, I think this was brought up by Representative Crawford earlier in the day, to change marijuana from a Schedule I to a Schedule III Controlled Substance Act. As a truck driver myself that grew up in the trucking business, my brother is still in the trucking business, I know it's difficult to hire and make sure that our drivers are safe. Matter of fact, it's real difficult part of hiring right now because of the drug testing. But part of the safety includes knowing the driver could pass that drug test. It's not something that we want to stop. So I want to ask you about since DOJ's actions will stop marijuana testing of DOD-regulated safety-sensitive employees. Now, let me tell you who all this includes, including school bus drivers, airline pilots, train engineers, subway and public bus operators, ferry operators, truck drivers, pipeline operators, FAA air traffic controllers. Will you commit to ensure that DOT will continue to test for marijuana as it currently is permitted to do, even if it moves to a Schedule III drug?
Yes, our commitment to that testing continues regardless of the schedule, and we believe our authorities are intact too because they don't call for testing by reference to where marijuana sits in its classification, but rather it's specifically named. So whether we're talking about the regulated community, those drivers you were talking about, or whether we're talking about our own personnel, somebody with a security clearance or somebody in a tower, our understanding is at this time is that nothing about that reclassification would change our practices.
Here's the problem. Well, just so you know, 1980s is when DOT did the result and resulted in the program that the accidents were caused by people using marijuana and the problems that occurred. If we don't stay with that program, and the thing that's difficult about that is right now when we have a driver shortage, you can have a beer on Sunday and you're not impaired to drive on Monday. Now you can smoke a joint on Friday. You may not be impaired, but it's going to show up in that test, and it'll show up for 30 days. Something's got to be figured out as far as that's concerned if we're going to continue down this path, because it makes it very difficult as a truck owner and a business owner to find the employees that aren't spending their time smoking dope in their parents' basement and are more concerned about having a job. And we've got to figure this out, and I hope that you'll continue to work on that to make sure that not only it's safe, but that we can also have drivers and figure out how we're going to do this if we're going to continue down this path.
Agreed.
Thank you. I yield back 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Boy, would I love to spend the next hour on that debate and get that information out there. I will point out that the petroleum industry has been subsidized for the better part of 120 years and continues to this day to have very, very significant subsidies. However, Mr. Buttigieg, Secretary, thank you so very much. I'm thinking back on the very first days of the Biden administration. Within a few months, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act became law. After 4 years where the previous president said, we're going to do an infrastructure bill, never happened in the previous administration, but during your tenure it did. And thank you so very much for your very significant leadership in making it happen, and also picking up a very, very important part of an American policy, and that is make it in America, buy American. And I know that you've worked hard on that throughout. It was one of the major parts, pieces of the legislation, and it's going into place. However, all of that seemed to have been held in abeyance by a waiver to a 1983 law that waived the Buy America requirements for transportation. So the good news is you're well into solving that problem. A couple of months ago, actually about a year ago, several of us brought to your attention this waiver, general waiver of the Buy America requirements of the 1983 law. My understanding is that you have a proposed rule out to terminate that waiver. And I understand that the finalization may be in progress. Could you please bring us up to date on that?
Thank you, yes, Congressman. We're very focused on making sure that we square the need for swift and efficient project delivery with our administration's commitment to make sure that when we use American taxpayer dollars, it's buying things that are using materials made in America. We recognize that that's a long game because we're building for gaps in our manufacturing base that won't be filled overnight. But we know that we have an opportunity here to build those industries through both the demand and the rules that we have. Right now, DOT and the operating administrations are working to provide guidance over the guidance that came out from OMB to help specify any answers to questions that project sponsors might have, knowing that there's a lot of complexity to this. To be clear, some waivers may be required, but they will be limited, targeted, and conditional, and only offered when we're confident that it's the right thing to do and still does right by our overall goals to build American capacity.
I thank you for that. Those of us that have been on the Buy America train road for the better part of our careers are going to watch very closely about the breadth of those waivers and the length of them. Short-term waivers, perhaps necessary, but if they become long-term waivers, then we've accomplished nothing on the Buy America, Make It in America, and rebuilding our industry. I want to thank you and the President for putting in place an industrial policy for the United States. This is one piece of it. There are a couple of other elements out there I want to bring to your attention with regard to Buy America. Chairman DeFazio, when he was here, and Senator Cornyn and I and others brought to the attention of all of us that the China Railroad Construction Corporation and BYD were finding a way of bringing into the United States Chinese rolling stock from Chinese government-controlled companies. That seems to have been abated. I urge you to watch carefully. They're trying to get around that in many different ways. Finally, the application of all of this to airports. The waiver may apply to the airports. Watch carefully. The policy of the President was to make it in America, Buy America. You and I and others will work diligently to see that that happens. Thank you.
Thank you. You have my commitment to work with you on that.
Thank you. Yield back.
The gentleman, Mr. Carvajal, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Buttigieg, I understand that the U.S. Department of Transportation has announced that $520 million is available for Cycle 1 charging and fueling infrastructure, CFI. This is for applications that are highly recommended or recommended. In my district on the Central Coast of California, the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments is spearheading a $20 million grant application that would fund the installation of 21 direct current DC fast charging stations along the US 101. SBCAG's application has been listed as recommended. When should applicants start hearing from your department regarding the outcome of their applications?
Thank you for the question. We're hard at work on the CFI program, which is a companion to the NEVI program. Already 47 awards have been made, amounting to $623 million, and of course future rounds will bring future awards. We'd be happy to get more information to your office about a timeline. I know that we had our latest notice of funding opportunity out on May 30th. Part of what we're trying to do with those rolling applications is to get quicker answers to our project sponsors, because we know how important these facilities, especially those DCFC, DC fast charging facilities that are challenging sometimes for the private sector to do on their own. We know how important those are to communities like those that you serve.
Thank you. I want to pivot to another issue of importance to my district that was brought to my attention by the County of San Luis Obispo. For decades, the federal government has required commercial service airports to use Florentine firefighting foams that contain PFAS. The recently passed FAA reauthorization bill includes a provision that I helped write for a new grant program that gives airports $350 million over the next 5 years to assist in their transition from aqueous film-forming foam, AFFF, to fluorine-free foam, F3, or foams that don't contain PFAS. What is the FAA doing now to help airports in their transition to these new foams?
Well, thank you for your attention to this issue. We know this is not just an environmental and safety concern, but also an economic concern for airports. FAA has done a lot of technical work, found that performance standard in partnership with DoD that does not require the use of PFAS. And now that that new standard has been put forward, there is a transition plan, an aircraft firefighting foam transition plan, published roughly a year ago with stakeholders from the DoD to firefighters to environmental groups. We will continue to work closely with our airport partners, helping them identify best practices, helping them prepare for this transition, and to the extent resources are an issue for them, welcome further opportunities to work with you on making sure they have what they need.
Thank you. Last year, OMB finally, after 2 years of uncertainty, clarified the Buy America provisions established in the bipartisan infrastructure law that did not apply to construction materials such as aggregate and asphalt binder. This would have put significant restrictions on supply chains for aggregate and asphalt binder. Will the administration continue to pursue new Buy America provisions, and if so, does the administration plan to allow for waivers on manufactured products?
We are continuing to work to try to ensure that project delivery is kept swift and affordable while meeting our Buy America commitments. The new guidance, we hope, is helpful to our project sponsors, but we know that sometimes it needs interpretation, and we want to make sure that we provide further guidance as needed. The Federal Highway, FAA, FTA, and FRA rules for iron and steel and manufactured products have not changed, but we continue to be ready to work on whether it's waivers or policy guidance to help make sure our project sponsors understand what's required.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, one of the FAA's most successful and cost-effective government industry partnerships for taxpayers is the FAA Contract Tower Program. There are 264 airports in the program, including the SLO County Airport in my district. This critical air traffic program, safety program, supports general aviation operations, DoD flight training operations, and military readiness, commercial air service, and flight schools across the country. What assurances can you give us that contract towers will remain a high priority for DOT and FAA?
These are certainly an important part of our national aviation system. There's currently a total of 263 contract towers in the program. I would note as one indication of the importance we place on them that the President's fiscal 25 budget request seeks $256 million to fund that program. It includes measures to try to cover the cost growth that has taken place. Vendor contract prices have escalated about 22% from 2020 to December last year. We're continuing to work to help them keep up.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman
I'll take
yields.
this 26 seconds.
Mr. Nels is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Good to see you, Mr. Secretary.
Afternoon.
16 months since East Palestine. Obviously, the NTSB report came out the other day. I've been placing close attention to it as I chair the Rails Subcommittee here. And I believe that she produced a very detailed report, and some of her findings, quite honestly, are very disturbing. One of the areas is that post-derailment actions. And when the American people saw this big bloom, this cloud above their city, the decision to vent and burn, and that procedure, according to the report, it appeared that Norfolk Southern made that decision. Apparently, they were able to, I don't want to say convince or get the incident commander to agree with that. The report appears that the NTSB said that Norfolk Southern compromised the integrity of that decision to vent and burn the tank cars by not communicating expertise and dissenting opinions. The justification, according to the report, is polymerization, which is that chemical reaction that could cause the explosion. So a point is that they said we have to do the vent and burn because we feel this thing could blow up. What are your thoughts on that? How would incident commanders allow them to do that when we had dissenting opinions?
One of the most troubling things in that report, I agree, was the finding that the vent and the polymerization that was feared by those who thought that by undertaking that vent and burn action, they were preventing an explosion. might not have actually occurred, meaning that the vent and burn did not have to happen. So certainly, while that will go to different parts of the decision chain than those that our department is directly involved with, we want to closely follow how NTSB's recommendations are taken on board, both in terms of how they apply to a railroad and how they apply to anybody in that incident command.
And I can understand it was in a rural area, first responders, many of them volunteers, driving to incidents in their pickup truck with bunker gear in the back. Maybe I don't want to say the skill set wasn't there, but they just didn't. If a derailment like that would have happened in the city of Houston or Boston or someplace, I don't think you would have burned it. You would have had a massive showing of logistical support with hazmat teams, this and that. But hey, in your testimony, I'm concerned about the railroad crossing elimination program. We know we have about 700 plus deaths a year as it relates to rail. And your testimony says it's improving or eliminating 400 rail crossings. In IJA, it's 500 million. My friend, I don't think that's enough. We need to do more. I mean, if that is a safety issue, we need to do more. What do you think we should do with that program?
If you'd like to propose growing that program,
I
we'd love to work
will.
with you on it. It's,
I will.
we've had our chance to go out to some of the first projects.
We're gonna
getting
do it.
funding there. We announced it in North Dakota. The enthusiasm
We're gonna do it.
in communities is extraordinary, and I think it's so far been very well
How
received.
about the Ask Rail? What do you think about the Ask Rail? The report says, they didn't know what was in the cars. They didn't. The first responders didn't know the chemicals. They didn't know the consist in the cars. But the actual consist was up in the locomotive. But they didn't get it for a couple of hours. So here these first responders are out there trying to figure out what the hell's in these cars, and they didn't have it. Now, the Ask Rail, I think, is a good thing. I think all Class 1s use it, but we have to do something to make sure that we have the connectivity with cell service in these rural areas, because the Ask Rail app will be combat ineffective if we don't have it. One of the colleagues mentioned about the close call reporting system. I support it. I think it's a good idea. How do you think that, quickly, how do you think that will improve safety in our rail industry?
We think it creates one more opportunity to flag safety issues. We're glad to have a handful of participants, but we really believe it ought to be everybody. And
I agree.
Whether that's done by some kind of requirement through Congress or whether we all just continue pushing the Class 1s, I really hope we can get them.
Automatic track inspection. Obviously, a lot of technology out there. I don't think a lot of people know about it. How can we, this is the tough stuff, how do we get labor and labor and the railroads together on the same page as it relates to these technologies? ATI is a great thing. I mean, it can do a lot.
I think a lot of the best technologies in the history of our economy have a track record of creating and expanding jobs, even if they change some of the aspects of what those jobs are like. But our posture is that and to be clear, we support and sometimes even ourselves use ATI. We just haven't seen the data that allows us to be confident that you can remove the human factor.
Sure.
One
quick
needs
thing.
to be
You
alongside.
support two-man crew?
We do.
Okay, last one. The tank cars, the DOT 111s, the 105s, 117s, I don't know if everybody understands that, but we want to phase those out, right? The 111s by 2029. I think we can do it quicker. I would like to move that up, and I'll do everything I can to do that.
That is great news and one of the provisions we're most excited about in the pending bipartisan legislation.
All right, thank you.
The gentleman yields. Ms. Sykes is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Recognize Mr. Johnson from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Great to see you. And you arrive at my doorstep on a high as far as electric vehicles are concerned. I want you to continue on this streak that you are on right now, explaining why it's important that our economy lead in terms of adopting new forms of clean, renewable energy, automobiles representing a big part of that. Would you, I want to open the floor to you to kind of talk about why we're heading in this direction, why it's important that we continue to do so.
I appreciate the question, and I want to emphasize part of why I care so much about this is that I grew up in northern Indiana, the industrial Midwest, and the home of what had been the Studebaker Car Company, which went out of business 20 years before I was born. And that meant that I grew up surrounded by crumbling and decaying factories that were a consequence of our automotive economy and our part of the Midwest not keeping up with the most recent and necessary processes and technologies. So I know what's at stake. economically for our country in terms of the importance of us leading the EV market instead of finding excuses to hold on to dirty and expensive fuels and old technology for as long as humanly possible. I also appreciate the opportunity to return to one of the important dimensions of the exchange I was just having with Representative Burleson, which is life safety. ACS data suggests that 29,000 deaths per year are attributable to human-caused domestic omissions, including 7,700 from truck use and 9,700 from passenger vehicle use. We have a chance to change that. And if there is any problem, safety or otherwise, with any new technology, that's not an excuse to stop pursuing new technology. It's an imperative to make sure that that new technology unfolds well, unfolds safely, and that's what our department has been doing for as long as it's existed.
Yes, our EV technology is world leading at this point, but it is subject to being overshadowed by what is taking place in other nations. Can you talk about that?
Well, China has invested hugely in its EV capabilities. I don't believe that's because the Chinese Communist Party is enthusiastic about the environment. I believe it's because they perceive the economic and strategic benefits of trying to dominate that market, which is one of the reasons why the Biden administration is protecting the U.S. market with appropriate tariffs on that unfairly subsidized Chinese industry. We face fierce competition from around the world, just as we did in the first chapter of the automotive industry. But we're determined as an administration, and I'm determined as a child of the industrial Midwest, to make sure that America leads the way in the EV revolution, just as we led the way the first time around in the arrival of automobiles a little over 100 years ago.
You know, the Biden administration has been responsible for creating 16 million plus new jobs during this 3.5 years in office. Can you tell us about job growth that is associated with the EV industry?
Well, we've seen EV battery and manufacturing facilities rise across the country, of course, in Georgia, in my home state, both my new home state of Michigan that I married into and my state where I grew up of Indiana. And whether we're talking about the battery side or the manufacturing side, we know that we've got the opportunity to create new, good-paying jobs. Part of what was at stake in the UAW strike and the historic contract that those workers earned was to make sure that that EV economy continues to create not just large numbers of jobs, but good-paying jobs. And that's part of why the president was so proud to be with those auto workers as they sought that great opportunity.
First time a president has been on a picket line.
That's true. Yes, sir.
And I'll note that the union movement has just exploded since the Biden administration came into office.
It's been an extraordinary time for American workers, historic contracts in many sectors, including, of course, transportation and manufacturing.
Thank you. Let me ask you this question. The Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority and the Georgia Department of Transportation applied for the Department of Transportation's mega grant program for their Georgia 400 Express Lanes project. This project will combine the Georgia Department of Transportation's express lanes and dedicated bus rapid transit lanes to significantly improve congestion and transit access to over 120,000 jobs within a mile radius of the 5 stations. Can you discuss the strategic timing and expected outcomes of the mega grant awarded to support this initiative?
Thank you. We're working through those mega grant applications through the course of this year. Certainly recognize the enthusiasm around this project, and I can commit to you I'll make sure it gets every fair consideration, and I'll become more familiar with the specific project.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Ms. Chavez recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, of course, there are always going to be a certain number of things you and I disagree on, but I have to start with a compliment. In a town where so many of folks, both in my party and your own, seem to peddle fear and anger, some of them almost exclusively, you bring a far more professional and respectful approach to your work, and the communication that I get from you and your team, I think helps all of us be better. So thank you with that. As you know, sir, we have a tremendous amount of flooding in my state and surrounding states. It's just devastating to watch people, friends of mine, who their home, everything, all the physical possessions that they own washed away by these floodwaters. As you know, during disasters, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration
has the ability to waive some rules, things like weight limits, hours of service, so that impacted communities can get help more quickly. I've got some concerns that a recently finalized rule by FMCA is going to make it more difficult for governors to access those flexibilities. I just wanted to gauge any thoughts you would have on that promulgation.
Let me certainly, first of all, tell you that our heart goes out to those we saw impacted by recent storms in your state, Iowa, and other communities, and would agree that it has been important to have flexibility on things like hours of service in the context of those disasters. Now that you've raised this, I want to become more familiar with some of the areas of overlap or concern where more recent rulemakings could diminish flexibility on that, because we certainly leaned into that at many moments, notably including the Baltimore bridge collapse, to try to provide some relief.
And I think we've got to, not listen, I get it. A lot of these independent and quasi-independent agencies, it's not like they work for the cabinet secretary. It's not like a memo comes out and they salute, and it's more complicated than that. They need to make their decisions based on an evidentiary record. Clearly, these decisions need to be abiding. They need to go to court and defend them. That's what's so surprising about this. I mean, the previous flexibility, the waiver authority for governors, allowed them a 30-day period. This is going to shorten it to 14. Keep in mind, the evidentiary record before the administration is that there hasn't been any particular abuse that they identified, and that there is no evidence that there's been a degradation of public safety because of a 30-day waiver period. And so to the extent we should have good decisions based on good data, I'm grateful for your commitment to dive in and better understand that situation. Let's go to permitting. This has been a consistent area of agreement that you and I have shared as you've appeared before the committee. I think in the couple of years you and I have been talking about this, we've made some progress. Let's be honest, it's modest progress. It is still, as you've talked about in your comments in the past, far, far more difficult to get a project cited in this country than it is in most every other developed nation. This is not an area of American excellence. I've had some success in working with my colleagues to advance a digital NEPA review, gotten that language in the aviation bill, yesterday in the water resources bill. I wanted to just touch base with you, sir, and see if your shop has been able to make any progress, particularly in the area of digital NEPA review and processing.
Thank you. Share your sense of urgency and interest here, and I would not challenge your assessment that while there's been progress, it has been modest. We have taken a number of steps to try to make the NEPA and permitting process more efficient. We've expanded a liaison program that can provide targeted assistance to project sponsors who would benefit from that. We've been doing more with programmatic agreements so that if multiple projects have similar characteristics, they can travel together, and we think we can cut some of the red tape that way. Specifically to your question about web-based digital, or sometimes e-NEPA is the term of art, we certainly see a lot of potential here. There's too much literal paperwork in the paperwork. One thing we've done to try to embrace that is a $750,000 modernizing NEPA challenge, knowing that some of the best ideas probably won't come from the building, but will come from around the country. That just launched in April, but we're looking forward to seeing the different ideas that come back from project sponsors there. And of course, we're working to maximize the use of categorical exclusions, which just bring a lot less of that process with them.
I do think categorical exclusions are a ripe area. I mean, we obviously make use of a lot of them, but I think there is so much more there. My closing comment, Mr. Secretary, would be at some point, you're just going to have a brainstorm, and maybe as you drift off to sleep or you're eating your Cheerios in the morning, of an idea that might be a little politically dangerous. It might upset people on your team or on my team, because let's get it. I mean, we both get it. The siting of large projects in this country is fraught with tremendous emotion and political peril. If you're looking for partners to advance your big, dangerous, but important idea, this committee is ready to work with you. Thanks much.
I appreciate that and welcome that. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Auchincloss is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, we have recently seen overall traffic fatalities start to decrease, but fatalities of vulnerable road users, such as pedestrians and bicyclists, continue to rise. Under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, Congress required states to complete vulnerable road user safety assessments. The law also required states with high rates of pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities to dedicate a portion of their highway safety funds to stopping these needless deaths. What is the department learning from the implementation of these provisions, and what else is needed to reduce pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities?
Oh, thank you for the question. Like you, we've been heartened to see improvements in the overall numbers of roadway fatalities over the last 8 quarters in the U.S., but we continue to see very troubling patterns in terms of pedestrian and cyclist injuries and fatalities or vulnerable road users. Part of what we've been able to do about it is through our Safe Streets and Roads for All program to help communities, including those undertaking the assessments you've described, implement plans that better protect vulnerable road users from exposure to traffic. I fear sometimes that media or other accounts of things like bike lanes treat them as ornamental when they are really about life safety. And whether we're talking about bike lanes, lighting, signage, or other measures, many of the things that we're now able to fund in hundreds of communities across the country are, we believe, contributing toward a safer environment for pedestrians, cyclists, and other vulnerable road users to go about their commute, their trip, whatever they're doing, without harm.
Mr. Secretary, last fall, the department issued guidance on how 2 loan programs, TIFIA and RIF, can be used to support transit-oriented development, including conversions of unused office space to new housing, which is particularly needed in the District of Columbia, which I represent. Has the department authorized any federal funds for office conversion projects, and how can we get more funds out the door?
We've got a number of those in the pipeline, and our first transit-oriented development loan was closed in April, the Mount Vernon, Washington Library Commons project, which is now under construction. We're very hopeful that this program will lead to support for those conversions you were describing. Post-COVID commuting patterns are changed, and the mix of what different cities require in terms of housing versus commercial square footage is different. We want to make sure we're helping them make use of opportunities to do those conversions, knowing the housing crunch that so many communities face. We can't predict a definite timeline for when some of the other applicants will be ready, but we are working through a number of applications as we speak. We'd be happy to keep you apprised of the development of that new pipeline in the TOD funding.
I want to discuss the importance of strengthening consumer protection in transportation. This past April, the department issued a final rule requiring aircraft carriers to provide automatic refunds when airlines cancel or significantly change their flights. I recently introduced the Household Goods Shipping Consumer Protection Act with Representative Ezell to give the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration more authority to protect consumers from fraud in the interstate transportation of household goods. The Federal Motor Carrier Transportation Safety Administration receives thousands of complaints every year from Americans who are victims of fraud in the shipment of household goods, and my bill would grant the agency the authority to reimburse states for enforcing federal consumer protection laws related to the transportation of household goods and to assess civil penalties against unregistered shippers against entities that hold consumer personal goods. What other steps is the department taking to strengthen consumer protection in transportation, Mr. Secretary?
We see how fraud in the movement of goods has created just gut-wrenching stories from people who are vulnerable when somebody else has possession of their goods during a move. So FMCSA has increased its efforts to combat external fraud relating to commercial motor vehicle and driver operations. Legislation such as what you have led on introducing could give FMCSA the explicit authority needed to assess civil penalties for violations of commercial regulations, withhold registration from applicants who have failed to provide the right verification demonstrating that they are legitimate, and allow us to expand our household good program by engaging states as force multipliers. So we welcome this and appreciate your work on it.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Pappas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, welcome back to the committee. I appreciate your thoughtfulness and how much time and how accessible you always are to this committee, so it's great to have you back. And it's always a good time to talk about how the bipartisan infrastructure law is working for our districts. I see that in New Hampshire. We're set to receive about $1.4 billion in state formula funds for highways and bridges over 5 years, which represents a significant increase over what we could count on in previous years. And already about $850 million has been announced for New Hampshire roads, bridges, roadway safety, and other major federally funded projects. So Secretary Buttigieg, as you know, federal law allows states like New Hampshire to use toll credits to cover local match requirements for federally funded projects. But since states could historically only use toll credits for projects within the state where credits were accrued, many states left extra toll credits on the table. That's why I have advocated for legislation, the Toll Credit Marketplace Act, provisions of which were included in the infrastructure law, which will develop a federal marketplace for toll credits, which will allow states to sell any excess credits to cover the match required for federally funded projects. I think it's a common sense change. We discussed this last year when you were before our committee. I'm wondering if you can update us on any progress with the toll credit exchange pilot program that is anticipated to roll out soon.
Thank you, and first let me associate myself with your enthusiasm for what the infrastructure law has brought, and most recently, congratulations to your district on the Rockingham Planning Commission successfully receiving that Seacoast Greenway Hampton Marsh Trail funding. With regard to the toll credit marketplace program, we recognize the importance of the value of an innovative program like that that you worked to create, and I know that they're looking to use their toll credits in new ways. I can report to you that the Federal Highway Administration has made a lot of progress on that. As you know, anytime you stand up a novel program, it leads to a lot of work that goes on in the background, which we're working through. But the focus right now has been developing the right program procedures, including the application and the selection process, making that as transparent and as rigorous as possible. And we'll continue to keep you updated on the team working expeditiously to get it stood up and ready to use.
Well, I appreciate that. I know my state has itself hundreds of millions of dollars of unused toll credits that are on the table, and I know other states are eager to be able to deploy these resources to make the necessary investments that will improve roadway safety and improve our economy. Now, my state's at a decided disadvantage when it comes to formula funding distribution. And since coming to Congress, I've worked to evaluate current funding structures to ensure states like mine get the adequate support that they need and that it's distributed in an equitable fashion. The calculations used to come up with the formula are, I believe, grossly outdated. For example, a state like Rhode Island, with half the roadway mileage of my state, received 30% more funding in fiscal year 2024. Vermont, which has about half the population of my state and fewer federal miles, received nearly 23% more in federal highway funds than New Hampshire did in fiscal year 2024. There are other states that are treated, I believe, inequitably by the formula, including Texas. I'm wondering if you'll conduct a study or providing any information for our committee as we think about the future of highway funding in terms of the formula and areas where we can look to make it more balanced and equitable for states like mine.
Thank you. We'd certainly stand ready to provide any information, data, analysis, or technical assistance requested as Congress contemplates future changes to the formula. As you know, we work to implement the formula as provided by Congress, but certainly hear loud and clear from many states who have found that the formula is not consistent with their expectations based on their needs, and happy to do anything we can to make sure that Congress's deliberations about that are well informed.
I appreciate that. Drunk and impaired driving traffic deaths have increased by 33% in the last 5 years. Even as vehicles are getting safer, crashes, injuries, and fatalities are still on the rise. In the United States, someone is killed or injured in a drunk driving crash every 39 minutes, and an average drunk driver has driven drunk nearly 80 times before their first arrest. Currently, only 24 states in the District of Columbia, including my state, require ignition interlock devices to be installed in the vehicles of first-time offenders. Studies have shown that the use of these interlocks reduce recidivism by up to 70% in first-time, repeat, and high-risk offenders. That's why I've introduced legislation on this, and I'm wondering if you can comment on ignition interlock systems and the role that they can play in terms of roadway safety.
We certainly recognize the promise and the potential of these interlock systems, given, as you noted, the proportion of highway fatalities and road injuries and fatalities that are associated with impairment. NHTSA has been working to help research, develop, and test solutions, including ignition interlock programs and the driver alcohol detection system for safety. A lot goes into that, and of course, need to make sure that anything that goes out into the field is ready to meet the high bar we're going to set for it. I would note that there was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking put out in December to gather more information on technology and research in this regard, and we'll be working through that ANPRM and continue to keep you apprised of progress there.
Thanks. We look forward to more information. I yield back.
Very much. We will now begin a round of 5-minute questions for our witnesses, and I ask all of our colleagues to please keep track of the clock and try and stay within those 5 minutes. Let me begin. We have heard from all of you, your testimony as well of our colleagues on how bad the conditions are on the ground. I want to start by asking about impacts if Congress were to continue to delay in providing this disaster funding. And Secretary Buttigieg, I want to start with you. DOT has provided $187 million in quick release for states hit by Hurricane Helene to address some of the urgent repairs and ensure the safety of the traveling public. That was a critical, immediate step, and it's left now. I understand the department has less than $120 million remaining for that emergency relief program. If we fail to act quickly, what happens if another hurricane or winter storm hits?
Well, in short, we would be unable to say yes, either in full or in part, to those quick release requests. We work to turn those around in a matter of hours when possible, and we have been able to say yes to 100% to those quick release requests. I'll also note that that figure, $119.6 million, is not just quick release, but the program balance. So in addition to those very quick answers, twice a year we do the allocations for the overall fund, whether that's for recent disasters or ones going back a few years where a community is still in recovery. Those two would be impacted because it's all the same funding. And so very quickly we would be simply unable to support any of these disasters.
Thank you. And Administrator Guzman, in 2024 and 2025, SBA received over 280,000 applications from disaster survivors. That number, I understand, is expected to increase in the coming weeks. And meanwhile, the SBA Disaster Loan Program has been unable to originate new loans for more than 35 days, and 60,000 renters, homeowners, and businesses remain stuck in the backlog now. Talk to us about the impact of this lapse on disaster survivors and explain why we need to provide that funding now.
SBA provides that support for those who don't have insurance or are underinsured. In addition, these are people who do not have credit elsewhere. And so these constituents are faced with higher costs of capital or no capital access at all to be able to rebuild their lives. And so with delays, this further impacts them. As I said, I have nearly $1 billion sitting there waiting to deploy as soon as I get funding, plus the additional 48,000 applications that we are still processing. $30 million a day is what we approve. So the longer this sustains, the further these constituents will not be able to access the program. And I would say that for the businesses, it's not just the businesses, it's the homeowners, the renters. 70% of our funding goes to homeowners and renters to get back in their neighborhoods.
Right. And if once we do replenish this account, how long will it take for that money to hit bank accounts once we act?
We would switch back our systems from the technology perspective and hope to get those awards within 24 to 48 hours. However, these are loans. We would need to continue through the process and finalize those loans to disperse dollars within as fast as 24 hours to up to 2 to 4 weeks.
Okay, thank you very much. Administrator Criswell, the Disaster Relief Fund as we all know, plays a really major role in helping our communities respond to these disasters. We provided access to over $20 billion in the DERF during the CR period, and the administration's latest request includes another $40 billion. Can you explain how the disaster programs of other agencies impact overall response and recovery efforts, and how these potential funding shortfalls for other disaster programs actually affect FEMA's work?
These disaster programs really work as a holistic way to help communities recover from disasters. While our programs support specific areas like in individual assistance, we can give homeowners that are underinsured or uninsured some funding. Our programs are not designed to replace insurance or make them whole, and that's where these other programs from USDA and SBA, CDBG-DR really come into play to have a holistic approach to community recovery. And without the supplemental disaster funding for all of these agencies, it will slow down recovery in these communities and really making it more difficult for the individuals, homeowners or renters, small businesses, and the community in general to be able to move along quickly in their recovery process.
Thank you. And let me just address this spread of misinformation and disinformation. Just quickly, what is the real-world harm if we see this misinformation, disinformation on communities?
You know, one of the things that we have to do is make sure people have faith in their government and that they know that the programs that they're providing them are going to be there to help them. And when we spread information that is inaccurate about what we are going to do or how we administer our programs, it creates fear, and people don't want to apply for assistance. And these are people that have lost everything, and we need them to be able to have confidence that when they apply for assistance, they're going to get what they need, what they deserve, and what they're eligible for.
Well, thank you. And I know in the past we've seen administrations attempt to withhold disaster funding from states and communities that were affected by some of these devastating disasters. I do think I speak for every member of this committee when I say the spread of disinformation and any efforts by anyone to withhold funds Congress has appropriated for the purpose of assisting communities in their time of need will not be tolerated, whether it comes in the form of a frontline worker or the highest levels of government.